All right, we are live. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's an unusual time slot for me, so I hope that you all are enjoying either being early in the day or more convenient time slot, or are staying up late to watch us. Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be looking at a video by Mohammad Hijab where he offered some arguments that he says are for Muhammad's prophethood. I'm not sure that's really what they're for, but that's how he titled the video. So that's how we're titling the response. I think we'll probably do this in two parts, get through the first half of the video today, and then at a later date to be determined, get through the second half. Let me open us with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the technology that allows us to connect with fellow believers and sometimes unbelievers from all around the world. We ask that any Muslims watching this material approach it with an open mind, realize that hijab can be mistaken, that his arguments are not necessarily good just because he is a quote-unquote authority and he offers them, and evaluate the arguments for what they actually are on the basis of their truth or falsehood. We ask that you be with us today, that you guide our discussion, and that you prevent us from gross theological error. We ask that whatever we say that is true and useful is applied to people's lives, and whatever we say that is false or not useful is simply forgotten.
I think you muted yourself.
All right, on the backup here. I got a beep, beep, beep notification that the microphone had been unplugged. I didn't actually do anything, so hopefully you can hear me now, though. Yes? No?
Yep.
Okay, good. So we're joining today. I'm probably pretty familiar with him, but I'll give him a chance to say what he's been up to. I know he's doing a series through Galatians, progressing at the hyper speed of half a verse in 2 hours every week to 2 weeks, depending. So at this rate, he'll be in Galatians for the next 40 years.
Yeah. So I am Anthony Rogers. I imagine we have some crossover between our audiences because I also do stuff on Islam. Although, as you just mentioned, mostly recently I've been studying through a book of the Bible, thinking that would be profitable to people. One of the criticisms Muslims will often make of Christian channels is they spend all this time addressing Islam and never teaching Christianity. And I never wanted that to be true in my case. And of course, I don't think it's always true of the people they're charging it against. They just ignore all the stuff they're saying about Christianity and only take note of the stuff they're saying about Islam. But so I've been working through Galatians. I do a bunch of other stuff on the channel. I look at biblical prophecy, specifically messianic prophecy. I think there's a lot of value there, not just apologetic value, but doctrinal content and other things relevant to the Christian faith. I address Islam. I engage Unitarians in debate, things of all sorts. So I've been doing that sort of thing for many years since I was converted. Always wanted to tell people of Christ, and that brought me immediately into conflict with people. I assumed that they'd want to hear the good news. Quickly found out that they wanted to oppose it. Hearing that their sins could be forgiven was taken as a personal attack rather than as the good news it really is. And so that led me to study various groups as well as what the Bible teaches and have an answer for them. So I've done that sort of thing for couple of decades, written for Answering Islam for various theological journals, have contributed to various books. I used to work with David Wood on his channel, still do stuff with David, but I don't post stuff currently on his channel. I do it on my channel. So that's basically me.
Excellent. So we'll go ahead and dive into the video from Hijab here. I will warn you that in the main portion, he speaks Arabic, so maybe I'll read the English subtitles, which he provided. Although I suspect they might not actually always be accurate, but hey, he provided them, so we'll just go with them. But first, a message from Hijab here. So there you go. You got to share this video for extra rewards. It was a little thing there where he was telling you to donate money and then share the video, but he told you to share it. So, I mean, we got to take his word for it that you'll get some rewards for doing so. Let's go ahead and look at his first few words here. He claims that this is 10 minutes of arguments for Muhammad. If you take out all the repetition and the fluff and his random attacks on Christianity, I think you maybe get like 6 minutes of actual content. But he does say a good amount of stuff. So let's look at this first portion. So the second part, as we mentioned, is sufficient conditions. We said the first part is necessary conditions and the second part is sufficient conditions. Necessary conditions like when God challenged the disbelievers within the Almighty saying, then produce a surah like it, and call your helpers other than Allah if what you say is true. So first question for you, Anthony, is what are necessary and sufficient conditions?
Yeah, so this is Hijab's attempt to be philosophical. I've noticed in recent years that he's styled himself something of a philosopher. And honestly, listening to him, philosophy is not my first love by any stretch, but I'm not a stranger to philosophy. Had many philosophy courses. My undergraduate was basically a philosophy degree. It's a Christian thought degree, but the basic area of study is the history of philosophy in relation to Christianity, that sort of thing. Anyways, these terms are used in that context. So a necessary condition is something that would have to be true if the conclusion that you're arguing for is going to be valid, but it's not necessarily enough, right? It's not necessarily sufficient to infer the conclusion. So a sufficient conclusion would be something that not only is requisite to the conclusion, but is enough to infer it.
And we'll get to his actual argument on the Sarah Likett challenge here in a second, but he seems to suggest it's a necessary condition, which I find very bizarre. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I think all the arguments are bad. So,
Yeah, well,
yeah,
I mean, I think basically he doesn't actually understand what the terms mean. He just threw them in there for no reason. Because that and he never comes back to it. Like he never gets to sufficient conditions. He just says the apparently it's necessary that the Quran Surah like it challenge. I mean, I can understand how it would in theory be an argument, but I don't see how if you don't have this, then you can't be a prophet, which is what he's suggesting.
right. Yeah, that that's a good point. So I didn't think of that, but part of it for me was it just kind of seemed like the video picks up with his arguments almost as if there's another part that preceded it. That's just how it appeared to me. Like he took some
Yeah,
clip from something and then threw this commercial onto the beginning of it, and didn't realize that it just sort of seems like you're, you know, in the middle of a race and you're finding out you're in the middle of a race and you know you start running.
yeah, I'll give him credit. I had the same impression that it was extracted from a larger video or something. But he does later on say I can't explain all these things in this short little video. So I'm not really certain that it was extracted from a longer video or what.
I'm sometimes when people use that line, I understand. Like when you have a journal entry and you say space doesn't permit me to address this or that or what have you, but when somebody's doing their own video where everything's at their disposal, right? He determines how long this video is going to be or not, and there's no limits to what he can put on YouTube. I don't know what that sort of thing means in that context. You know, I don't have enough time to go into that or enough space. I mean, he could have made it a longer video. I don't know.
Definitely. So Tatiana asked if this is a new hijab video. It's about like 2 or 3 months old. When I proposed this to Anthony, it was brand new, but but it took a while to actually get him on.
Yeah, Anthony's bad.
But I think I forgot to put a link to that in the description, so I'll add that afterwards. And so we can go ahead and see why he thinks the Surah like it is a good challenge here. He mentioned even the enemies of Islam, such as Walid. Walid, in his famous saying about the Quran, he says, has sweetness, it's in the top and there's nothing above it. And that it destroys what is beneath it. Even the enemies of Islam, such as Al-Walid, fully and decisively admit that the Quran is not from the words of human beings, nor from the words of poets. So I'll just throw it open to you to point out some problems with this argument, and then maybe I'll have a couple things to add.
Yeah, so just to repeat what you were saying. So Hijab argues that the enemies of Islam, and he gives a specific example, acknowledge that it surpasses what one can expect from a human being. And so this is supposed to prove that the Quran is from Allah. Now, it's interesting. The Quran itself doesn't limit us to those two options because the Quran levels the challenge to human beings and the jinn. It says, bring together, amass as many people as you want and all the jinn and try and produce a surah like it. And so if Al-Walid said that this surpasses what could possibly be produced by any human being, it doesn't necessarily even follow from the best interpretation of that or the strongest interpretation of that it has to have come from Allah. It could come from the jinn. It could come from Satan. There's not even one category of jinn. There's good and bad jinn. So that wouldn't be sufficient, to use Hijab's language, to bring down the conclusion that the Quran is from Allah. But if he's going to cite somebody like this saying the Quran is inimitable, that's one of the terms they like to use for this. It's not something that's capable of being imitated, somebody else producing it. Then it's likewise relevant to consider the testimony of other non-Muslims. And the list is quite long. I didn't get a chance to locate it, but this is a book written by Ali Dashti. He's an Iranian fellow. He was a journalist and at one point decided for various reasons that he wanted to write a book on Islam, but he knows the Arabic language and he's got this long paragraph in there talking about just how terrible the Quran is from the perspective of Arabic grammar and syntax and all the rest of it. And it's interesting to me, and I always like to point this out, it's striking to me that as a non-Arabic speaker, that I can go to the Quran and discover discrepancies grammatically with the Arabic. And let me explain what I mean by that. Somebody might say, you just said you don't know Arabic. Well, I know language, right? And there's at least certain things that are common across all languages. To be a language at all means that certain things have to be true, right? And so there are certain things that anybody who knows language can evaluate by looking at something. And also, there are all sorts of tools that are available. One of the things that I've used much over the years is a website called IslamAwakened.com. IslamAwakened.com. On IslamAwakened.com, it allows you to go to any verse that you want and press on the verse, and then it'll give you a list of like 50 translations of the verse. And you can then compare them. And I remember one time I was reading a verse of the Quran, and I remember thinking to myself, I remember this verse differently when I had read it before. I used to read the Yusuf Ali translation all the time. And then I was reading this other translation. I think it was by Aisha Bewley, famous translator, contemporary translator. And it was very different. And I thought, I wonder why it's so different. And so I went to the online to that IslamAwakened.com and I looked and I noticed that the translators here were all over the place. right? The verse, by the way, is Surah 26, 16. Let me read you one example of a translation of this. This is the Wahiduddin Khan translation. It says, "Go to Pharaoh, both of you, and say, 'We are messengers from the Lord of the world.'" So this is a verse where Allah is allegedly addressing Aaron and Moses. And he's telling Aaron and Moses what to say to Pharaoh when they go to him. So Allah says, according to this translation, he says, "Go, both of you, to Pharaoh and say, 'We are messengers from the Lord of the worlds.'" And when you look at other translations, so here's a translation from Mohammad Hijab. This is a famous translation. I have a big, thick copy of Mohammad Hijab's translation that I got for free from CARE, which is the Council of American and Islamic Relations. It's basically Islam's version of the ACLU, right? So they used to send it out for free, but it's really big and thick and has all these great footnotes in it. And in Muhammad Assad's translation, it says, "And go, both of you, unto Pharaoh and say, 'Behold, we bear a message from the sustainer of the worlds.'" So notice the difference here. Already, it changes from being a personal noun, right? Instead of saying, "Go and say to Pharaoh, we are messengers," right? It's messengers is a reference to Aaron and Moses. In Muhammad Assad's translation, it says, "Go and say to him, we bear a message." So now it's talking about the content of the Quran itself. Hey, Adam, good to see you. But also it's singular in this translation. Now, neither one of these are what the Quran, the Arabic, say. Okay, but this is the point. The point is, I'm looking at these two different English translations, and I'm thinking these are very different. It's not just all languages change. And so sometimes if you are translating from one language into another, you need to update the translation as that host language, now changes to reflect the differences that have taken place over time. But these are all relatively contemporary translations, and I'm just thinking, what gives here? This is very different. And then I go and look at other translations, and here's an example of some other translations. Let me just get to the point. Here's the Aisha Bewley translation. Her translation says, "Go to Pharaoh and say, 'We are the messenger of the Lord of the worlds.'" Right? Now, when you read that, already you're thinking, that's not even good grammar, right? Go and say to Pharaoh, you, Aaron, and Moses, and say, "We are the messenger." It's singular. So then on the Islam Awakened website, they have an option to look at the grammatical breakdown of the Arabic. And they show you the parts of speech and whether it's singular or plural and how it's used elsewhere in the Quran and all that sort of thing. And so I'm looking at the Arabic as they're breaking it down, and I'm thinking, this is a real problem. This is not just, and I already knew there had to be a problem, because not only do I have these very different translations, but there's no way that a Muslim translator like Aisha Bewley is going to intentionally give a translation that is grammatically wrong, right? So I already knew there's a problem here. I could understand a translator trying to obscure a problem, but I can't imagine a translator trying to create one, right? So that was my final clue. And when I went to the breakdown of it in the Arabic corpus, it was all confirmed. And so then what I did was I wrote something up on this. And at the time I was writing a bunch of stuff for Answering Islam, and I sent it to Jochin Cates, who's the owner and administrator of the website. And then he passed it along to a bunch of Arab-speaking Christians and said, "Hey, do we have something here? Is this correct?" And they're like, "Yeah, absolutely." And they were all shocked because they're all Arab speakers. And here's this, non-Arab speaker who found this. And so I always think of that as like, not any indication that I know Arabic. I make no, claims or boasts to know Arabic. but to show you just how bad the Quran is, right? How bad does this book have to be that somebody who doesn't speak the language can find such an obvious flaw in it? And that article, it kind of woke me up for in a way that I hadn't been before, because for me, my natural inclination in engaging Muslims and engaging Islam is to go after what I consider to be the big issues, like our differences of, concerning God, our differences concerning Christ, concerning the gospel, Christ's life, death, burial, resurrection, claims about Muhammad's prophethood, like we're talking about now. But when I eventually wrote this article, it became the most, it was the article that Muslims responded to the most. And I thought, obviously this bothers them more than all this other stuff that I'm talking about, right? And we know why, because this is the one argument that the Quran makes for itself. Muhammad, when he's challenged to produce miracles like the prophets who came before him, he says, I wasn't sent with miracles, I'm only a warner. In fact, even in one place in the Quran, it says, why aren't miracles sent down to him like those that were sent down to Moses? And that's especially problematic because Muslims claim that he's the prophet like Moses. But performing miracles is one of the three specific criteria that are given in that prophecy, right? If you look at Deuteronomy 18 and Deuteronomy 34, there's a handful of things that are specifically mentioned in connection with Moses that would have to be true of the prophet like Moses. And one of them is that Moses performed miracles in the sight of all Israel, right? As well as talked with God face to face, neither of which were true of Muhammad. And so in any case, Muhammad eschews any ability to perform miracles, but sets forth this argument. The Quran is so perfect, so beautiful, so eloquent, so inimitable that nobody can produce anything like it. And now I know I'm ranging a little bit beyond this specific issue of hijab citing this person who's an enemy of Islam, giving credence to it, but I think it's relevant to the overall issue, because one of the things you have to ask is, what kind of motivation, for example, might somebody at the time of Muhammad have to speak well of the Quran? Now, obviously, if they're an open proponent of Islam, then they're going to say that sort of thing. But even in their case, we know that there were many people who professed to be Muslims who didn't really have Islam in their hearts, because the Quran tells us that, doesn't it? It talks often about the hypocrites who will say one thing with their tongues, but then later will say something else. Why are these people playing the hypocrite? Okay, it's not the same sort of thing that you see. We would grant that there are hypocrites among Christians, but there's a motivation there for somebody to want to, pretend to be Christian. What sort of motivating factors are there for somebody at the time of Muhammad to pretend to be a Muslim? Well, one is you might lose your head if you don't, right? That's a big one. But even in the case of somebody who's not openly admitting Islam, there would be some motivation along these lines, because, maybe somebody's hedging his bets, thinking, well, if Muhammad ends up getting the upper hand, I don't want to be on the wrong side of things. I mean, there are any number of things that you should be asking yourself if somebody is not a Muslim, but he's telling you that the Quran has this character or quality about it. It's already suspect. If this guy really believes that about the Quran and it proves what Mohammad Hijab thinks it proves, then why wouldn't he be a Muslim? You know what I mean? There's already a problem with this sort of thing. And I got a bunch more to say, but I'll stop with that since I talked for a bit.
Hey, no worries. So I have the source of this quote up on the screen here. To read the actual quote: by Allah, the speech which he utters is sweet and graceful, fruitful at the top, copious at the bottom, and it has the upper hand, and nothing has the upper hand over it. So before we address the source of the statement, let's take this at face value. Mohammad Hijab claimed that this fully and decisively declares that the Quran is from God, according to the speaker. Do you see that in this statement?
That he said what? That the
So Hijab said that this statement by an enemy of Islam fully and decisively, and that's a quote, fully and decisively, says that the Quran is not from a human being.
Yeah, no, so that, yeah, obviously it's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow.
Yeah, I agree. Even if we say that this quote is legitimate, all he's saying is that it's the best speech he's heard, which doesn't mean it's not from a human. It just means it's the best speech he heard. But the source of this statement is actually very interesting here. This is the Asab al-Nazul by al-Wadi, which was written around the year 1050. So that's problem number one. But problem number two is that this is supposedly the occasion for revealing 7424. So supposedly, Walid made that statement, and then immediately after it said that the Quran is nothing more than human speech. We can jump over there to the actual verse. So the large portion of Surah 74 is about this individual, which is not defined in the text, but historically has been attributed to Walid. So then he recontemplated in frustration and frowned and scolded and turned his back on the truth and acted arrogantly, saying, "This Quran is nothing but magic from the ancients. This is no more than the word of a man." And this is the source that Hijab goes to say that enemies acknowledge that this is from God.
Yeah, and so one of the things you have to wonder is if they didn't embellish the quote to begin with. But the trajectory of this is obviously to deny the Quran being from God rather than to prove that it is from God. And it's always well to remember whenever you see any reference to magic, demons, or any of that sort of thing, how obsessed the Quran is with this issue. Because remember, well, let me put it this way. So I know there are a lot of Christians that are quick to run to the explanation that Satan is the origin, the direct origin, say, of Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, whatever non-Christian group you want to talk about. And my inclination, and I'm not saying it's, I'm just talking about inclination here, not final conclusion, but my inclination is to think that all these religions can be accounted for simply in terms of human sin and depravity, right? It doesn't take Satan to explain why Joseph Smith would want to start Mormonism, where he would then be entitled to a multiplicity of wives, a level of authority and power and so forth. That seems to me like a universal aspiration of many men, or I said universal and then many men. But my point is that, that's just a very common thing. And so you don't need Satan to be the direct author of something. That doesn't deny that Satan is active in all of this. I'm just saying he doesn't have to be someone who immediately appeared to Joseph Smith and so forth. But I mention that because I say it's not my initial inclination to just jump to that conclusion. When I look at the stuff concerning Muhammad, if I had to pick one person that I thought there was good evidence for him having a direct encounter with Satan or one of his minions, it would be Muhammad. And that's on the basis of his own testimony, right? I mean, it's incredible when you look at it. So I know you're familiar with this sort of stuff, but for the audience, I mean, just think about it. Muhammad's mother gave him to a wet nurse, a Bedouin woman, to care for him. That was common practice in the day, right? This was a means of income for the Bedouin women. For people that dwelt in the city, it was considered better for them to grow up in the environment that the Bedouins inhabited. It made them healthier and all this sort of stuff, more rugged. And so he was raised by a wet nurse for a period of time, but the wet nurse prematurely brought Muhammad back to his mother. And his mother kept saying, why won't you keep him and so forth? And she didn't want to give his mother a reason. and his mother kept pressing him. And finally, the woman says, there's something wrong with this child, basically. She's afraid that he's possessed is basically the idea. So here you have all the way back in Muhammad's infancy, this idea that this child is somehow associated with the demons. Then, as Muhammad's growing up, there are other incidents in his life. And when you look at the Sirah literature and other stuff, and it talks about an incident that Muhammad experienced where he falls to the ground, and the report, that the explanation that's given of whatever's happening is that the angel opened his chest and took out his heart and cleansed it in the Zamzam water and all that kind of stuff. That's the interpretation of what happened, but that wasn't what was visible to other onlookers. And so I think this was probably one of the early episodes of what would be true of Muhammad. Numerous reports later in his life when he would receive alleged revelation. I'll come to that in a moment, and you probably know where I'm going. But when Muhammad first encountered a being in the cave, who's not at first identified as the angel Gabriel, when he encountered this being in the cave that turns out to be a very malevolent figure, right? This being comes to Muhammad and says, recite. Muslims like to say read, right? But he says recite, and Muhammad says no. And the reason Muhammad is saying no is because in the Arab mind, the poets excelled at poetry precisely because they were inhabited by the desert jinn. And Muhammad had come to despise this sort of thing because he was enamored with the religion of Judaism and the sort of things that he saw in the case of the Jews. In fact, he was very envious of the fact that the Jews had revelation, but no revelation had been sent to Muhammad's people. And the Jews would constantly rub it in their face and say, a prophet's coming and he's going to help us against you. And so Muhammad's envious of this. He thinks that there has to be a prophet sent to his people. So the last thing he wants to be is one of these poets. He wants to be more like what the Jews claimed was true in their history. And so when he encounters this being in the cave and he's told to recite, he says no. And then the being manhandles him, right? He basically, squeezes him, presses him until he virtually loses consciousness. And then he releases him and tells him again to recite. Muhammad says no. And once again, this malevolent figure does a WWE SmackDown on Muhammad, right? And this happens 3 times until Muhammad finally acquiesces, recites, and then he flees from the cave. And according to Muslim sources, Al-Tabari and others, Muhammad feared that he was possessed, that this was an encounter with a demon. And so he said, woe is me, poet or possessed. And there was a lull in the revelation, between this encounter and his next, reception of revelation. And we're told during this interim period, Muhammad several times went up a mountain to throw himself down because he said, never will it be said of me by Quraysh, that I'm a poet, that I'm possessed. So Muhammad initially thinks that he's possessed. That's his initial fear. Then when Muhammad gets revelations, his revelations subsequently are all, at least a significant portion of them are attended by strange physical phenomena. He would fall on the ground. He would flop around like a fish. He would moan like a camel. He would froth at the mouth. He would hear the buzzing of bees and the ringing of bells and stuff like that in his ears. And in the Bible, you have 2 explanations for this. Sometimes it's just described as a physical malady. So it could be nothing more than a physical problem that a person has, or it's described as the result of demonic activity, right? So here again, and now I want people to note that carefully. I'm not saying everybody who has some physical problem is necessarily, that's a sign of demonic possession or anything like that. But these are 2 options, right? You have cases where people are simply described as being sick, other cases where they're being weighed down by Satan. And Interestingly, in the Islamic sources, the bell is considered an instrument of Satan. Muhammad's, it says that he would moan like a camel when he received his revelations. According to the hadith, if you eat camel meat, which by the way is forbidden in the law of Moses, they like to point out that pork is forbidden, but camel meat is too. But they're supposed to do voodoo. I don't know voodoo. It's a voodoo. I stopped to stress that. I probably said it wrong still, because every time I say it, Muslims think, "Aha, we caught you! You said the word wrong." So your argument's wrong. But anyways, so you're supposed to perform wudu because water extinguishes the devilish energy that one gets from eating camel meat, because apparently camel meat somehow involves one with demonic energy, and so it has to be extinguished. So I mean, just all these different things, and then you have over and over again in the Quran, it's like it reminds me of if you go into work, let's say, and there's an employee there, and he suddenly says, "I didn't steal your wallet," and you say, "What are you talking about? I didn't say you stole my wallet," right? And then you look for your wallet, and your wallet's gone, and you're like, "Hey, you mentioned not stealing my wallet before. Why? I didn't steal your wallet," and then you go, "Okay, I'm just going to let this go." And then every time you see the guy who says, "I didn't steal your wallet," you'd start, I'm sure, probably not after the third time, but after the first time, thinking there's a problem here. Allah over and over again in the Quran seems obsessed with reassuring Muhammad that he's not demon possessed. You're not possessed. You're not possessed. Really, you're not possessed. Drop this idea that you're possessed. Quit telling Muhammad that he's possessed, people. You start to think there might be a problem here. So this goes back to this statement of this Walid figure. Muhammad was obsessed with this idea that he might be demon possessed, and it wasn't just his initial encounter with this being. Even I didn't pull up the hadiths or anything, but there are hadiths 10 years into Muhammad's alleged prophethood where he's having doubts and he's worried that this was all a sham, and there are people taunting him, saying things like, "Has your demon left you? Have you lost your inspiration?" and that sort of thing. And Muhammad is downcast as a result of this. So Muhammad is suffering under this idea, and so to bring forward this statement from Walid, right? I forget his full name, but this character as proof, when what he's saying is, this stuff is, he's not arguing that this is from Allah. That's not his conclusion. And why does the Quran then dismiss the charge that it's magic? Right?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, I think that the story's made up. I mean, I don't think that Walid ever said this, because it doesn't make any sense. Why would he say, "Yes, this is such glorious speech, and by the way, it's from a human being"? And then, of course, the Quran verse had to be revealed in response. More likely, the Quran verse was there, and they made up a story about why it was revealed. That doesn't quite make sense. But even if we take the story and pretend that it's true, it doesn't support Hijab's argument.
Yeah. One thing that might be helpful to people. I mean, one thing that always gets me about this argument is this. Muhammad is supposed to be Allah's last and greatest prophet, and Islam is supposed to be a universal religion, whereas what came before it wasn't. Now, as Christians, of course, we reject that. We believe that Christianity is intended for the entire world. Christ is the savior of all who believe, and the only savior of those who believe. So but Muhammad, according to the Muslim view, is God's last and greatest messenger, and this is a universal message. So why would Allah choose as the greatest proof a book that's eloquent. And I know Muslims will say, well, at the time, poetry was the thing that, the going thing in Arabia. But remember, the claim is that this is the last and final religion, the last and greatest prophet, and it's supposed to be a universal religion. So why would the proof, the great capstone, be something that would only possibly be detectable by people who know Arabic, right? What is one of the first things Muslims like to tell us as soon as we criticize the Quran? Oh, you don't know Arabic, right? Well, okay, I don't know Arabic, so I can't possibly be impressed by this claim that the Quran is, so eloquent. Well, then they'll say, well, people who know Arabic think that the Quran is this beautiful thing. Well, I know plenty of people who think it isn't, and that is just as much at the time of Muhammad as at the present time. In fact, here's one of the interesting historical facts. Muhammad was giving his prophecies in Mecca for over a decade before going to Medina. And by that time had not accumulated very many followers, right? I don't remember the exact number, but it wasn't far away from a dozen. And it wasn't until Muhammad went to Medina and then amassed a following there that could exert, throw its weight around a little bit, right? They start pillaging and looting and robbing caravans and so forth and flexing their muscles, that then you start seeing people come into Islam. And this is where you get... I'm trying to think of the poet's name. There was a 8th century poet who said, the sword is more telling than the book. The sword is more telling than the book. And what he meant is that it's ultimately the sword that has determined the influx of people into Islam, not the book. And obviously the people of Mecca knew Arabic. Why weren't they impressed? Why weren't they impressed until Muhammad had a sword to their throat? Right? All these claims about people being impressed didn't amount to anything until Muhammad started cutting off heads. But then the other thing is this: when you think of something like the Satanic Verses, right? Why would Muhammad, and I know some Muslims will try and claim this isn't a true story, but and we could get into whether we should accept any of this stuff, claims about Muhammad, whether there's any good reason to accept most of this anyways. But these are their sources, and by the criteria that they apply, this story has clear evidence for it, right? If anything in Islam has evidence for it, it's something like this story. The number of witnesses that talk about this, Muslims, is really high. I think there's something like 50 different sources of Muslims saying that this was a event. And, so when people apply certain historical criteria, for example, the criteria of embarrassment, they'll say, no Muslim would make this up. This is not the sort of thing they would make up. So that's one factor in favor of it. Plus, there's just so many witnesses for it. But here's the point. Muhammad delivers these verses to the Meccans with other Muslims in attendance, and he does an about face. He now acknowledges the intercessory power of Allah's daughters, Al-At, Al-Uzza, and Manat. He refers to them as the high-flying cranes, a way of referring to them as those that ascend, right, that are able to carry their prayers up to Allah. So he's acknowledging these deities, their intercessory power. And so the Meccans and Muhammad and his followers that are with him bow down on this occasion. Later, Muhammad's followers that weren't present upbraid him for this. And Muhammad, quickly says, while I was reciting, Satan cast his words on my tongue. Okay, now here's the reason this is problematic. At the time, Muhammad couldn't tell the difference between the words that were given to him by Jibreel and the words that were allegedly cast on his tongue by Satan. Neither could the companions of Muhammad that were with him. Neither could the Meccans. If the Quran is so supremely eloquent and shows itself to be from Allah, and that it cannot possibly be from merely a human being or the jinn, and the people that are best capable of discerning this, certainly the Meccans knew Arabic, right? They knew Quranic Arabic. They knew the Arabic that was spoken in the 7th century. But they don't discern any difference between, it's not like there was any, it's not like Muhammad was speaking the words from Jibreel, and then he got to these words from Satan, and they're like, oh gosh, the quality dropped off there drastically, right? No, what surprises them is what he's admitting to at this point. But so there's another example, right, from the Islamic sources that, so I mean, you have this issue, like, how am I supposed to discern whether Islam is true on the basis of this alleged proof if I don't speak Arabic? And then I go to those who do speak Arabic, and nobody's impressed by it. They're impressed by Muhammad's use of the sword. And then you've got stories like the Satanic Verses episode, where neither Muhammad nor his companions nor the Meccans are any the wiser that Satan had a word to say on that occasion too. Right? I mean, one more thing real quick is the fact that if you look at the codex of Ubay bin Ka'b, Ubay bin Ka'b's codex has 2 additional surahs in it. Muhammad said that Ubay bin Ka'b was one of the best of reciters. He listed 4 people that were the best of reciters that people should go to learn to recite the Quran. Ubay bin Ka'b was one of them. In his codex of the Quran, there are 2 additional things that he considered to be surahs. Now, the whole Muslim world today would reject those as bona fide surahs. Now, the reason that's important is if Ubay bin Ka'b is one of the best of reciters, then certainly he knows Arabic. Certainly he's capable, if anybody's capable, of determining its surpassing quality, that it surpasses other things. And yet Ubay ibn Ka'b can't tell the difference between these 2 surahs that he thinks should be in the Quran and the rest of the Quran, right? So, I mean, this whole line of argumentation is just riddled with problems.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really bad argument, even in principle, even if it was true that it was the best. But then we look at it and it doesn't look very good. And I've never heard of a single person convert to Islam based on this. They'll convert on something else, usually a sense of community, but, maybe they're tricked by scientific miracles or something like that. Or, by Muhammad's supposed amazing morality, but never ever because they heard the Quran and thought, oh man, that's just so beautiful. I have to convert to that religion.
I've heard of people. I mean, I think what happens in some cases is, yeah, there's certain factors that impinge on them that kind of lead them in that direction. And along with that are claims being made about the Quran, and they just kind of buy into that. And they know they're supposed to think that's the case. I've heard people pretend that they listen to it, and you've probably seen some of these videos. I don't know, a TikTok video or a YouTube video where somebody says, "Hey, will you listen to this?" I've seen Muslims do this, and they'll put earphones on a person, and it's somebody reciting the Quran, and the person will say, "Oh, that's beautiful. What is that?" And then they'll tell them it's the Quran. But then you have other people that have gone out there and have taken something else in Arabic, done the same thing, and they've done it to Muslims, right, who don't know Arabic, and they think it's a recitation of the Quran, and they say, "Oh, that's so beautiful. It's obviously from Allah," and it turns out it's not even the Quran. So yeah, this argument's bad.
Yeah, I mean, it's the skill of the person, doing the rhythmic recitation that convinces people. We have some split on opinions here about whether Muhammad was possessed by a demon or whether he was natural causes. I wanted to highlight this one. The theories about epilepsy. What do you give credence to those?
Yeah, well, so remember what I said. I mean, first of all, to reject Islam is false. I don't need it to be the case that Muhammad was demon-possessed or directly encountered Satan or a demon. What I'm getting at is, because I believe there's sufficient evil in the human heart to account for false religions and all that sort of thing. It's not my first inclination to say that a religion, Satan visibly appeared to somebody to start a religion. If I had to put my money down on somebody, I'd say Muhammad is the best case going. And that's because of so much stuff in the Islamic sources, even Muhammad's own fears, his persistent fear throughout not only his life, but his prophethood, his alleged prophethood. That to me is really damning. But yeah, I acknowledge the possibility. Certainly, the physical signs are consistent with what we see in epilepsy, but they're also consistent with what we see in cases of demonic possession. If you read the Gospels, you have many of these features present when people are demon possessed, and it's not always the case when somebody's demon possessed that they have these features. I'm just saying that that is something that we see. And so when you just put all sorts of things together, to me, there's a lot of stuff there that I'm willing to say, hey, you want to, I don't believe in gambling. I'm just saying that, if you wanted to put money down and we could get a direct revelation on this, that's where I'd be putting my money.
Absolutely. I would concur with that idea. And I would just say that these sorts of medical diagnoses of historical figures, they're very questionable because you don't really have the access to the person. You're just going based on what people said, and the eyewitness reports aren't necessarily very accurate. And then in the case of Muhammad, we're talking about texts written hundreds of years after he died in most cases. So I would just be very skeptical of being that definitive and saying that it was epilepsy. But I could also go either way, either entirely natural causes or, under demonic influence, either or. We did have some other comments about why the Cyrillica challenge fails, the satanic verses, which you brought up. Christian Arabs are not impressed by the Quran, which you also mentioned. And this one, the chapter of the jinn. Several verses from a jinn who sounds suspiciously like Muhammad. And we have a super chat from Christian Family Man. Thank you for the informative videos. Reasoned answers. Keep them coming. God bless you and your future efforts. Without lies, Islam dies. Well, thank you very much. Now, I don't want anyone to think that we have these videos too informative videos. Let's see. So we had this comment from David. The angel Gabriel, in scare quotes, then went to Muhammad to reassure him that he was a prophet. But why would an angel sent by God cause someone to be afraid, have lack of faith? And then Muslim regular on my channel, presumably not directly in response to this, but he gave two comments. He didn't know that he was a messenger. When a strange thing appeared to anyone, he'll be afraid. He was a human being. All the prophets were accused like Muhammad. So my question here is this consistent with the biblical narrative and how people respond to visitation by angels?
Yeah, so, I mean, first of all, any encounter with a heavenly being is going to be associated with some sense of awe, right? If you look at some of the theophanic appearances of God in the Old Testament, some of them are more mundane, right? When God appears with two angels to Abraham, they appear as three men. But more often than not, the appearance that attends these encounters is more awesome in nature. The burning bush in the case of Moses, Isaiah being undone when he sees the Lord seated on his throne, Ezekiel by the river Kibar when he sees this sight of the glory of the Lord and the cherubim and the throne and so forth. There is definitely going to be this sense of awe. And if you're a sinful creature, there's going to be this initial thought of, oh no, am I being called to account, right? But that's the nature of the initial, perhaps, moment of concern. What is this? What's going on? Kind of thing. But there's never this sense of, you never get the impression that what these people believe they're encountering is a demon. Okay, first of all, that's never apparent in the biblical record. They're always aware that they're in the presence of God or an angel. They're never confused about that. The nature of the encounter itself carries with it that assurance, and that's the impression we're given in every encounter in the Bible. And the individual doesn't leave the experience with lingering doubts over it. His fears, to whatever extent they existed, are quelled in the encounter. So, for example, the angel says to Mary, "Don't be afraid," and she's not. After that, the fear goes away, and she doesn't go away saying, "I think I've been demon possessed," or "I think a demon appeared to me," and she doesn't start flopping around on the ground like a fish, and she doesn't moan like a camel and hear ringing in her ears and the buzzing of bees, and she doesn't start saying, "Satan cast his word on my tongue." She doesn't start saying, "Now we need to pick up the sword and start cutting the throats of our neighbors." Right? It's all very different. The angel that appears to Mary doesn't grab her and shake her around like a rag doll, right? And we could multiply the examples. Daniel's encounter in Daniel 8, Daniel 10. Initially he has this encounter. There's an angelic being, and he's like sapped of his strength. There's this overwhelming vision, and the angel tells him to rise up and stand on his feet. Instead of knocking him to the ground and slapping him around, he raises him to his feet. It's all different in the Bible, and you don't have this repetitious fixation on "I'm not possessed, I'm not possessed, I'm not possessed" in the Bible. You don't have the biblical prophets saying 10 years into their prophethood, "I wonder if I've been deceived all along. I wonder if I was demon possessed. I wonder why I'm being ignored now," and then being unnerved when somebody comes along and says, "Has your demon left you?" Right? That's all what's happening to Muhammad, right? All it took to throw Muhammad off of his, game is for somebody to come along and say, "What happened to your demon, Muhammad?" And Muhammad would suddenly be cast into despair and doubt, until Jibril came back and told him, "No, Muhammad, you're not possessed. Now go start another battle over here, and rob and pillage and so forth."
Absolutely. So I think we can go ahead and look at a little bit more of the video here. Hijab says something very bizarre, trying to prove that the revelations were judged by the contemporaries as being from God. It says, and as you know, at this time, people in the Arabian Peninsula, people knew poetry. They knew the pendants that were hung around the Kaaba. They could distinguish between true poetry and false poetry. So I have two questions here. One, what the heck is true poetry and false poetry? And the other question is, why in the world is he talking about pendants in the Kaaba?
Yeah, well, when he talks about true poetry and false poetry, obviously he doesn't explain it here, but initially my thought would be that the claim that's usually made is that the Quran is not poetry, in the sense that the Arabs, what they were doing was poetry. There's something different about it. But that doesn't really make sense the way he set it up, because he spoke of true poetry and false poetry as opposed to real poetry and something else. You know what I mean? In effect, he's trying to distinguish the Quran from the poetry of the pagans, then he's putting it into the category of false poetry, which that doesn't sound right. So I'm a little perplexed on what in the world he means here myself.
Yeah, maybe he meant good and bad poetry. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I give you an example of something that so maybe this may not be what Mohammad Hijab meant, but it is something that Muslims will claim, that the Quran is not the same thing as the poetry that the Arabs were used to reciting, and it has all sorts of differences that mark it out or off from those other things. And one of the things this has done is led Muslims to all sorts of ridiculous things, rationalizations. So for example, I pointed out a grammatical error in the Quran earlier. Well, the thing that a Muslim will do is he'll come along and he'll say that doesn't make any sense, because the Quran is the standard in the Arab world for good Arabic grammar. Right. Now, notice the problem now. We're supposed to be able to evaluate whether the Quran is what it claims to be, this perfect, most eloquent revelation by the standards of Arabic. But as soon as we point out that the Quran has grammatical errors in it, they start saying, no, the Quran is the standard. Right. So how can you evaluate the Quran now on this if the Quran is the standard? Right. That's just circular at this point. And unless you can show some inescapability to this circularity, then it's fallacious. It's a fallacious circle. Well, what ends up happening then is, well, here's another problem, and I didn't mention this before. I mentioned Surah 26:16, which has the grammatical error. Well, if we then run with that and say, okay, this is good grammar, when Moses and Aaron are both told to go to Pharaoh and say, we are the messenger, singular. Well, elsewhere in the Quran, it actually has it in the plural. The same statement is made elsewhere. And so if it's grammatically correct here, then what is it over here? Right? There are any number of ways you can account for why it's wrong here and right over here. One could be that Muhammad's Arabic improved. One could be that there were a bunch of grammatical mistakes in the Quran, and whoever's transmitting it corrected some of them and missed others. There's different ways to account for this. The fact is, you can't have it being perfect in both places. If one is decidedly, different in this way, that there's not grammatical agreement in the speakers and the word they use in reference to themselves. So, but Muslims will say that whenever they run into a problem in the Quran, they'll then make this the criteria, and they'll even start playing ridiculous games to pretend that something that looks altogether ridiculous is. It's always fun. This is one of the things that I think that Islam is patently false, and sometimes I have to find an excuse to listen to some of the things these guys are saying to keep myself involved. And I get some entertainment value out of watching these guys spin a explanation, right? So here's one of the big issues that plagues the Quran. It's the problem of Allah bantering back and forth between using first-person speech and third-person speech and singular and plural. So Allah who's allegedly the speaker throughout the Quran, he will be speaking in the first person, then suddenly start speaking in the third person. Or he'll be speaking in the singular and suddenly start speaking in the plural. And this often creates confusion. You wonder if this is somebody else talking about Allah, or if Allah's talking about someone else other than himself, it leads to rank confusion. And it's not just between verses. Sometimes it's within a verse. So what do Muslim scholars do? They come up with a fancy name for it. It's called iltifat, and it's supposedly one of the, magnificent features of the Quran that bespeaks its origin with Allah. And, honestly, I look at that and I think this just does not, this doesn't fly, right? So, if you look at Surah Al-Fatiha as an example, right? Surah Al-Fatiha is well known to Muslims. They use it in their daily prayers. I don't remember how many times they actually recite Surah Al-Fatiha between all the prayers, but the number of times that a Muslim ends up citing Surah Al-Fatiha throughout a day and the week in their life is astronomical, right? The first chapter of the Quran. Well, the Quran is supposed to be Allah's direct speech, and yet the first surah of the Quran is a prayer. So if it's Allah's direct speech, and yet the words are directed to Allah, then it would seem Allah is speaking to himself in this surah, right? But then, pulling up Surah 1 real quick, let me just read it real quick. It says, with the name of Allah, the merciful, the benefactor, the merciful redeemer. Actually, I don't like this. Oh, this is let me read Hilal Ali Khan. In the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful, all the praises and thanks be to Allah, the Lord of the worlds. Okay, so if Allah's speaking here, he's speaking to or about Allah. Then verse 3 says, the most beneficent, the most merciful, the only owner of the day of recompense. You alone we worship, and you alone we ask for help. Is Allah saying to Allah, you alone we ask for help? Now, in this surah, you don't have an example of Allah moving from first person to third person, but here you do have Allah being addressed in the third person. And that already by itself is confusing. So what do you do in a surah where Allah is switching back and forth between speaking self-referentially about himself and then, or to himself or what? I mean, it ends up leading to a lot of confusion. And if you check the commentators on this stuff, they often don't know where Allah is beneficent to himself. Yeah, compassionate to himself. I'm trying to think of a good example of where you have Allah switching midstream between I and we and he and us. I actually have a whole series of articles on this on Answering Islam, where I'm looking at the use on the part of Allah of third-person pronouns. Right. So,
while you're pulling that up, I'll read a couple comments here. David corrected you. He said that Allah is just being narcissistic, so there's no problem in Surah 1 there. And then this has absolutely nothing to do with anything, but I just thought it was hilarious, so I'm sharing it. Allah is Ronald McDonald, and his best-selling burger is the Big Macker.
The Big Macker. Yeah. Okay, here's an example. Surah 5, verse 15. Actually, this verse has all sorts of issues in it, but Surah 5, verse 15 says, O people of the book, remember Allah's supposed to be speaking, there hath come to you our messenger. So this is Allah referring to himself in the plural. There has come to you our messenger, revealing to you much that you used to hide in the book, and passing over much. There hath come to you from Allah a light and a perspicuous book. So Allah switches from speaking of himself in the plural to speaking about Allah, right, in the same verse. And when I say there's numerous problems with this, by the way, because a number of Muslims actually interpreted the last part of this where it says, there has come to you from Allah a light and a perspicuous book. Many of them viewed the light as a reference to Muhammad. Muhammad is Allah's light, and there are numerous hadiths that get wild here on this, explaining Muhammad as the light of Allah. And, some of the hadiths will talk about Allah making everything from Muhammad's light. So he created the angels, from Muhammad's light and all this different stuff. But it's similar to, and I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but in Surah 7, is it 156 or 157, where it's supposedly the statement that Allah, Muhammad's coming was predicted in the Injil, right? It says, yes. It speaks about the book being sent down with him, with Muhammad. And now it's one thing when you hear the Quran speaking about revelation being sent down to Muhammad, but that verse actually says sent down with him. What does that entail? I mean, if the Quran comes from Allah and it's sent down, then Muhammad was sent down with the Quran. This easily leads to all sorts of strange ideas and idolatrous notions, which some Muslims have not been slow to pick up on and run with. And so putting that together with Surah 5:15, where Muhammad is called the light, at least according to some Muslims, not all Muslims would interpret it that way. So you have Muhammad being Allah's light, it's sent down with the Quran, and so on and so forth. But yeah, not to get away from the main point, that Allah will often switch between using plural and singular speech. And instead of saying this is confusing, which it is, Muslims turn it into a proof. Look, there's no other book like this. This is not found in poetry. Well, yeah, I can tell you why it's not found in poetry. By your own admission, the Arabs at the time of Muhammad were exceptionally skilled in the use of the Arabic language. That's why they didn't say things as ridiculously as the Quran does, right? I'll concede to them. These Arabs had a mastery of their language, right? And that's why the Quran looks so different, because the guy who did it was illiterate, right? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, if they want to tell us it's unlike any other book, well, maybe we agree. No other book is so confusing and so bad at explaining its subjects while constantly claiming that it explains itself in detail. And no other book has so many grammatical errors and so forth. So Swati did tell you that the Arabic grammar is taken from the Quran, and I believe you addressed that. So pay attention, Swati. This is called a circular argument. If you're mistaken about grammar because grammar is defined by the Quran, then you can't use the excellent speech of the Quran as evidence for the Quran. And then we also had a different Muslim here with the totally on topic rebuke of us here. The cross is pagan. First, explain that. No, that's not how it argue for Islam. You need some evidence for it, not just evidence against something else, especially not all caps, 6 exclamation point arguments.
yeah. It reminds me, the guy in a rowboat passing another guy in a rowboat, and the one guy, let's just say boat one, points to the guy in boat two, and he says, "Hey, your ship has a hole in it. You're gonna sink." And then the other guy yells back, "Oh yeah, your ship has a hole in it too." Right? Uh, you're still sinking, right? And it just looks like you're lashing out because you took, instead of this as a loving warning, you took it as a personal attack, right? And so you just want to lash out back at the other person. But yeah, I mean, you don't get yourself off the hook by saying somebody else is on the hook. And of course the cross. First of all, I think he's probably equivocating here. I don't know what he means by saying the cross is pagan. In one sense, we would agree, right? That doesn't refute Christianity because, yeah, the Romans, who were pagans, that's how they killed people. Jesus was killed by the Romans on a cross. So there's no wondrous revelation there that has now caused the Christian faith to crumble. You've just affirmed a element of what we believe. The pagan Romans were the people that carried out the execution of Christ. Now, if you mean that, Romans weren't running around wearing crosses, by the way, so I don't know what they mean. If he means it in that sort of sense, like this is something pagans would do. The Romans weren't running around wearing the cross. They wouldn't even use the word crucifixion, right? If you look at Roman sources, they'll make references to it, oblique references. They'll use euphemisms. They wouldn't even use the word crucified because to them it was the most humiliating thing imaginable. That's why they devised it, to humiliate their victims. And so it's not pagan in that sense. They didn't use the cross as a symbol for their beliefs and that sort of thing. So it's actually, I think, an argument for Christianity that Christians would come later to embrace the cross as a symbol, right? I don't agree with what everybody does with a cross. I'm just saying that I have no objections to the cross as a legitimate symbol of Christianity, right? Thaddeus has a cross in the background. The cross represents Christianity. It represents the heart and soul of our faith. But that speaks volumes. If the cross was so repulsive to the Romans and to others, and yet Christians have come to glory in it, why? Right? Because, of course, it was on the cross and by means of the cross that Jesus secured our redemption. So Christianity has done away with the paganism otherwise associated with the cross. Maybe I'll put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. he thinks he's insulting us, but he's actually giving an argument, a legitimate argument for the truth of Christianity. There's something bizarre must have happened for people to suddenly embrace the most hated, vile thing in society of the time as their symbol.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the figure's name. There's a figure. Is it starts with an A, but there's a old graffiti of a person on a cross, and they give him like a donkey's head or something like that to mock him. And it's believed by many to be a reference to Christ. And you see numerous references in people like Tertullian and others to this, showing how far back some of this goes. So yeah, I mean, they used it as a way of mocking Christianity. So again, I mean, the pagans weren't using this as a symbol of their beliefs. The cross was the way of humiliating and shaming their victims. So Christians aren't adopting some pagan symbol. What we're doing is representing the central truth of our faith, that our Savior died a horrific death on our behalf because that's what we deserve as sinners against a holy God. Yeah, there it is.
Yeah, so I don't remember the name either, but the inscription basically says so and so worshiping his God.
Yeah.
So they were mocking this guy who was presumably a soldier for worshiping what
So
is interpreted to be Jesus on the cross.
It says Alexamenos, worshiping his God. Yeah. So
excellent. So we will continue with Hijab here. It's just a couple more words to say on the Saralaika, and then we'll get to his second argument. Let me share that. All right. The enemies of Islam have firmly and fully admitted that this Quran is not from the words of human beings and not from the words of poets. That's a clear evidence for Arab and non-Arab that the Quran is coming from Allah. And I believe that's the end of that. And I'll just say again, where's the evidence? All we have is this quote, which doesn't support that anyone who was not a Muslim agreed with this. We'll go ahead and move on here. So his second argument is going to be claims about the prophecies. Secondly, the Quran and the Sunnah mentioned with many prophecies that are mentioned future things that will come in the future, but these things, how can it be known? For example, and we'll get to the example here in a second, but I just wanted to briefly ask you if you think that, in principle, this is a valid criteria. If the Quran actually predicted the future, if Muhammad actually predicted the future, would that be good evidence of him being a prophet?
Yeah, but I mean, there has to be certain parameters here because, for example, if you're familiar with who was it? Is it Jean Dixon? This is a while back, but there was a lady who claimed that she had knowledge of the future, and she made several predictions. I believe it was during the time of Reagan's administration. And she had made like 3 or 4 different predictions about Reagan over the course of her, prognosticating and so forth. And one time she said he was going to be shot in his first term, another time in his second term, another time she says no, he wouldn't be. She gave just, the range of options, right? And when he did get shot, and first of all, you got to think, okay, here's one thing. What are the chances that a U.S. president might be shot? Well, it's not, I think I wouldn't have been surprised if somebody would have said during Obama's administration that somebody was going to try and shoot him, or during Trump's administration that somebody's going to try and shoot him. I'm actually surprised that nobody tried to, do anything because, it's the sort of thing that people who are very strongly polarized on different sides will, that's something that some of these parties might want to do. right? And we've seen it happen in our history, and we've seen it happen not only in our history, but in the history of other rulers and nations. People try to kill leaders. And so that sort of thing, you think, well, anybody could think that might happen. And if somebody had said it might happen or it was going to happen and then it did happen, I don't know that I'd be overly impressed with that, right? Just because there's a good possibility it could happen. Maybe I I want to take the gamble. If I'm right, then a bunch of people are going to start thinking that I've got some special insight, and it might be worth it. If I prove to be wrong, then I'll just kind of bury my head and, I won't rise to fame, but I wasn't famous before that anyways, right? So it might be worth the gamble. So, but anyway, she, in her case, not only made a statement that you could think anybody might think feasible, that Reagan could be shot, but she gave so many different statements that one of them was bound to be correct. Either he was going to be shot or not shot, either in his first term or his second term. Either, you know what I mean? It's just, there's only so many options. And what people do is they conveniently forget the times that she said something else, and all those proved to be wrong. And they only remember, at least her promoters only remember the thing she said that was correct. So if you have this sort of thing that is near term, and any observer who's at all observant might be able to guess, I don't think that would be overly impressive. What would be impressive is if you have predictions made hundreds of years in advance, and an exceedingly large number of them all happening in such a way as couldn't have been foreseen. Then that, and there's more things that go into, and I'm sure people understand what I'm referring to here. In the case of Jesus, we have hundreds of predictions, not just open prophecies, but typology. We have things predicted about him that couldn't have been foreseen. For example, crucifixion wasn't a method of killing people at the time some of the predictions of his piercings are made, that sort of thing. So anyways, the kind of prophecy that Mohammad Hijab is going to give us here is just, to me, it's not impressive even to begin with, even if everything is granted.
Yeah, we're going to see that all his examples are basically things that happened in Muhammad's own lifetime, which is going to raise a couple problems. But as Anthony said, even if we grant them that this is legitimate, it's still not impressive. Let's go ahead and look at the first example here. The Romans have been defeated in a nearby land, yet following their defeat, they will triumph within a few years. With Allah is the decision. Man, that was fast. All right, let's try that again. All right, so with Allah is the decision in the past and in the future. On that day shall the believers rejoice. In this verse, there's evidence that the Romans will defeat Persia and will do so between 3 and 9 years. And he said in a few years, and that means in the Arabic language from the 3rd to the 10th. Means from 3 to 9. From 3 to 9. And this happened when the Romans defeated Persia. So this is his first example of supposed prophecies. I meant to ask the chat to think, guess what prophecy he's going to mention first, because this is always their top example. And I'm sure many people would have thought of that. But I forgot to ask, so you'll just have to be honest and say with yourself and say, yep, that's what I would have guessed. But what do you think of this prophecy? Is it an impressive prediction? And does the verse even claim what Hijab says?
Yeah, well, the first thing is that this is just the sort of thing that I think any observer of how things were playing out, that's the sort of thing that they could look at and surmise. It's like, watching any, football game. I'm not a sports guy, but people that watch these things, they watch the back and forth, and then people say, hey, this team's going to beat them next time or whatever. Sometimes it's just wishful thinking, but sometimes it's based on somebody paying close attention to how things are happening, right? What's going on throughout the season, what's happening with these players, how well are they doing, and so forth. The fact of the matter is that the Romans and Persians had gone back and forth. And so anybody who was anybody at the time would look at this sort of thing and say, okay, this party got the upper hand now. The tables are going to turn again, not too far down the road, because that's what had been happening all along the way, right? This isn't a one-off. It's not like the Persians and the Romans suddenly had a battle that was unprecedented, right? And one of them got the upper hand. This was going back and forth. So Muhammad saying this, to me, is not impressive, right? Now, if I had good reason to believe that he made a bunch of predictions, the sort of things that are clear, couldn't be denied, and that sort of thing, then, I would look at this other one that's very weak and say, okay, we'll include that too. But we don't have that. This is kind of like the best. That's why you said I should have asked people, because this is the one they always go to, which tells you something. You don't put your worst foot forward. He's only got 10 minutes, right? He's only going to take 10 minutes to talk about the proofs of Muhammad's prophethood. He's not going to bring out the worst examples. So if he's talking about prophecy, this is, to Mohammad Hijab, one of the best proofs that Muhammad prophesied something. And I think this is just too easy as a prediction. So that would be my first observation. I don't know what you think about that, but as I see it, it's too easy. Any historian worth his salt at the time could have said that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be like, us saying, like, pretend that a U.S. election had just happened and say the Republicans were just defeated, but they'll soon triumph again. It's like, well, that's not really much of a prediction. That's just kind of how things go.
Yeah. I mean, back and forth, right? You get Democrat in the office for a while, and then you get Republican, and nobody's brilliant for saying something like that. And nobody's brilliant if they say in a few years either, right?
And then there's a couple additional problems, even with this being really weak. The story about when it was revealed says it was revealed in 614. We're going to later see that Hijab's going to claim that it's 618, so just keep that in mind. We'll come back to that, but just keep that in mind. And then there's also the possibility that the verse is actually ambiguous. My understanding is in the on-pointed Arabic, it can be read either the defeated will defeat, or the triumphant will be defeated, something like that. That it could go either way about who will be the ultimate victor. But we'll just grant that they have the correct version of it for the sake of argument. Job says about it. And even non-Muslims mention this, and it exists in our books of interpretation and hadith. But with that, even the divine books are outside the framework of the Quran and the Sunnah, such as, for example, the Chronicles of Theophanes. For a man called Theophanes was a Romanian, and he wrote an old historical book. And he mentioned that in the year 618. It happened as God Almighty said. So there's some interesting questions to be answered here. And the first is, why in the world did he randomly appeal to Theophanes? I mean, why didn't he just go to a modern historian and see what year they said this happened in?
Yeah, I didn't check out the quote from Theophanes. I'm wondering if you did, but...
Yeah, I have it here. Let me put that on the screen. So we got another problem, because he claims that Theophanes said this happened in the year 618, but this is his text about the year 618 here, and it doesn't say anything about the triumph of the Romans over the Persians, or vice versa. It just says, it says some various things about sending ambassadors back and forth. And then it says in the same year, the Persians took by war and Syria in Galatia. It doesn't say there was a decisive victory. So I'm not really sure why he appealed to this text, actually. He may have been looking at the wrong portion of it, or he may have just picked someone at random. But I looked it up, and historians say this actually happened. The definitive defeat was 627, so way more than 9 years later. So it seems the prophecy is actually false.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a false prophecy, and there are numerous statements in the Islamic sources that try and deal with this, right? So this is the standard thing that Muslims do. They play on people's ignorance, right? He throws something out here like this. Most people aren't going to check it out. They're going to say, "Oh, wow, that's impressive." First of all, I don't think it should be impressive, even if it was all, on the up and up. There's nothing overly impressive, as we already said, about somebody observing. It's kind of like Jesus rebuking the Pharisees for being able to discern whether it's going to rain or not, right? He says you can look at the heavens and so forth and determine from certain factors that it's going to rain, right? You're observant enough about past patterns and so forth to do that, but you can't even tell the signs of the time that are in front of you, what's happening, right? Well, anybody who was aware of current events could have predicted this sort of thing. But you look at the Islamic. So what I'm saying is it's not overly impressive in itself, but here's hijab playing on the ignorance of many people. Most people are not going to go look this sort of thing up. There's actually disputes or debates in the Islamic sources over what the statement means when it says that the other party is going to get the upper hand, right, after a period of time, right? Are you familiar with what I'm talking about here?
I'm not 100% certain where you're going, actually.
Yeah. So the statement itself. Let me look it up, but I'll let you say what you wanted to. But
Yeah,
there.
okay. So it did occur to me that maybe I should have read 617 as well, since the years don't quite correspond. But I just skimmed that, and I don't see anything about any kind of decisive victory there either. So I still don't know why hijab appealed to this text.
um. So yeah, there's a discrepancy over. I'm just trying to pull up this source. What the expression means? In other words, what time frame is
Yeah,
allowed
the
for?
gotcha.
Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about now.
Yeah. It was actually interesting that hijab said that it means 3 to 9, because Muslims usually try to deny that it's that definitive. They say that it's just a short period of time of unspecified length, because they know 9 years actually isn't enough.
Yeah, yeah. So um, basically, it'd take me a minute to pull it up, but basically, in the Islamic sources, one person, on the basis of Muhammad saying this, confidently declared that something was going to happen at, by X date, and then he gets rebuked for it because it turns out to be wrong, and but this guy is basing it on the language of Muhammad. And so what Muslims have tried to do now is they try and make the language more flexible, and mean something that would allow for the actual time span that elapsed before the reversal took place. Um, where is this? Let's see.
While you're looking for that, just a couple comments from earlier that I had starred, but then I ended up not reading. But since we're just filling some time here,
Yeah.
Carol said that Barika and Khadija were grooming Muhammad for prophethood for a long time. He was their mad prophet, and I think that's a reasonable guess as to what was happening. There does seem to be some involvement with, let's just say, spiritual forces from before the time Muhammad had his revelation. It wasn't just completely unexpected. And actually, we can see that from the fact he was going out and being in a cave in the first place, performing meditation and whatnot. He was trying to have a spiritual experience.
Yeah.
David said Muslims definitely embellish their own texts for polemical reasons. For example, they most likely embellish the Hadith, which speaks of some Jews identifying Muhammad as being a true prophet. And yeah, I mean, you can't just take these sources at face value. You can't say, well, someone said that according to Muslim sources, someone said Muhammad was a real prophet, therefore he is. I mean, even if that's true, the person doesn't really have any authority to make that decision. I'm not just going to take any random person's word for it. Every false prophet in history has had people say that they're a true prophet. I mean, that's not a very good argument. And then there's the question of whether the source is even accurate to begin with. And Toby says that the criteria for deciding what's reliable or not is anything that looks bad is not true.
Yeah, I just leave it with this personally. The basic issue is that if it means 3 to 9 years, then the date when the alleged prophecy was given is out of accord with when the actual victory took place, right? The actual victory takes place 12 to 13 years later, not 3 to 9 years later. So Muhammad makes a fairly easy guess that there's going to be this reversal, right? The one party got the upper hand over the other. This sort of thing happens all the time. Usually, the reason that sort of thing would happen all the time and there'd be this back and forth is because sometimes one party would surprise the other, and so what's going to happen is they're eventually going to regather their troops. They're going to look for their own opportunity to make a comeback, and then they're going to go back and have their period of fun, right? So Muhammad is just looking at the way the wind is blowing, and he's saying, oh yeah, this is going to turn around again. But he gets a little too ambitious by setting a date to it. And the date actually proves to be wrong. And we know from the Islamic sources that Muslims understood this to be referring to a period shorter than actually ended up being the case, because somebody among the Muslims went out and started basically, making a firm stand on the fact that this was going to happen, and it ended up being false. And so the other Muslims start ridiculing him for doing that, because now they all look silly. So this wasn't considered a proof in Muhammad's times that he was a prophet. It was considered a disproof. Everybody that knew about it found it as an occasion to reject Islam, right? And even the Muslim who banked on it ended up getting backlash from the other Muslims. You shouldn't have said anything about this.
Absolutely. So we'll go ahead and play a little bit more of the video here. And what if this didn't happen? If that didn't happen, it would have been evidence against Islam and against the Quran and against the prophecy of Muhammad. I'll just say, I agree. This is evidence against the prophethood of Muhammad.
Yeah, and we're going to have an occasion to rub this in a moment, given where he's going.
So then he says, by the way, I want to tell you something that you may not know about the Old Testament. There are verses where it is mentioned that the world will end. And we'll stop it right there before we get to his specifics here. But I mean, 2 comments. What does this have to do with Muhammad's prophethood? Nothing. He's just trying to attack the Bible like Muslims often do and think that that's an argument. But then, any guess? I know you know what he's going to actually say, but leaving that aside, any guesses of what he's talking about in the Old Testament?
Well, I think maybe the people, if they heard a little bit more of what he's about to say, might
All right, we'll just go ahead.
might think they have an answer to it. But hold on, let me say one thing though: is at this point, I mean, it's just obviously the Old Testament talks about verses of talks about final judgment, that sort of thing. So does the Quran, right? But he's going to say something specific like it.
Yeah, the Old Testament certainly does talk about the end times, but it doesn't put a specific date on them.
Yeah, and I think it's his next comment where he says something about.
Yeah, and I'm going to actually turn on the volume for this one because the translation clearly doesn't match what he says. So hopefully we can hear what he says. So he said that in his speech, he clearly said Olivet Discourse. But then the translation at the bottom says, C.S. Lewis says that in the Old Testament, it says that the most embarrassing verse in the Bible. So is the Olivet Discourse part of the Old Testament?
Okay, so I didn't, there was that discrepancy, and I didn't realize. I wasn't paying attention to the words that he's saying because he was speaking Arabic, and I just paid attention to the lower part. So obviously the Olivet Discourse is not part of the Old Testament. That's the short answer. Just not there.
Yeah, and this is a very interesting. I mean, I assume that he was responsible for the subtitles. Maybe he had someone else do them, but whoever did it chose to Testament. Maybe he also said Old Testament. Maybe he said the Olivet Discourse in the Old Testament. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well,
but
one thing I would say though is so my impression of Mohammad Hijab, I know he got very famous among Muslims at a particular point because he's very bombastic. He speaks in a very authoritative, chest-thumping style, and that ingratiated himself to a lot of them. And yet, when I hear him and have heard him in the past, I've always thought, this guy is not really familiar with Christian issues at all. I mean, he's really, really, really not well informed, right? And I'm not just doing that as a cheap shot or anything, because I would freely say there are Muslims I know that have done their homework. They've tried to study the Bible. I don't agree with their arguments, and sometimes I think they make arguments that are better than at other times. But at least I can recognize a difference between somebody who knows the material that they're constructing arguments out of and somebody who doesn't. And I've always had the impression that Mohammad Hijab is just way out of his depth here. In fact, I remember when he debated David, afterwards he made some comments, and one of the things he said was, here are the 3 or 4 books that I read. And I was like, are you kidding me? Right? And the 3 or 4 books that he mentioned are, books that I read 25 years ago. And it's not that they were bad books. It's just that, they hardly even constitute a sufficient source of information that enables you to be a competent critic of Christianity. But anyways, here, I think what he's doing is he's picking up something he heard from somebody like Shabir Ali. And, because Shabir Ali likes to use this argument and atheists like to use it, but a likely source is Shabir Ali. I'm not saying it has to be Shabir Ali, but he probably heard this, and given his, poor background in the material, he thought that Shabir was talking about the Old Testament. And when he heard the phrase Olivet Discourse, that sounded good to him, committed that sort of thing to memory. And now he's regurgitating it, but didn't have any clue where it came from. And I, when I first became a Christian, I remember there were verses that I heard before becoming a Christian and heard them so many times that I had almost memorized them, but didn't know where they came from. And so when I started reading the Bible, I would always go, hey, that's where that verse is found. right? And only then do I realize that this verse is from the Old Testament or that verse is from the New Testament. But here's Hijab presenting himself as some kind of an expert. He doesn't even know the difference between Old and New Testaments or something like Olivet Discourse or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for those that don't know, the Olivet Discourse refers to the sermon that Jesus gave in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21.
Yeah, so he doesn't actually, I mean, he probably doesn't know, but if he does know, he doesn't say what C.S. Lewis is referring to. But he's actually referring to Mark 30 or 1330.
Did you
Went
play
ahead
the
and put
part? Did you play
huh?
the part where he mentioned C.S. Lewis?
Yeah, we did. We just played that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So C.S. Lewis, if he actually looked at this, he would have found this very interesting quote from C.S. Lewis immediately after saying that this verse is embarrassing. He says, unless the reporter were perfectly honest, he would have never recorded the confession of ignorance at all. He would have had no motive for doing so except a desire to tell the whole truth. And unless later copyists were equally honest, they would have never preserved this apparently mistaken prediction about this generation after the passage had been shown the apparent mistake. This passage, Mark 13:30 through 32, and the cry, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" Mark 15:34, together make up the strongest proof that the New Testament is historically reliable. He didn't read this, but someone read it, and they dishonestly take the quote about this verse being the most embarrassing verse of the Bible, say, well, C.S. Lewis says this is embarrassing, but then what he actually goes on to say is that this shows the authenticity of that this is a legitimate eyewitness account, that the Bible is reporting on historical events. Have the actual passage up here. It's part of the lesson of the fig tree, from the fig tree lesson. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as the branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Of course, Muslims also like verse 32 there. There's several interpretations of this verse which don't make it problematic. Of course, hijab only will allow the one that makes it problematic. But I'm curious what's your preferred interpretation of this generation will not pass away.
Yeah, so, several things. First of all, for those that are interested in looking at this in more detail, I actually wrote a lengthy response to Shabir Ali many years ago on this, on the Answering Islam website. If you go to the left-hand column on the Answering Islam page and then look for the individual authors link, and then for my name, Anthony Rogers, then you'll find a list of articles that I have there. And there's a whole section of rebuttals to Shabir Ali, which I think is titled Coming on the Clouds. And so I have a lengthier response to this. Here's what I would point out. And actually, I'm going to use Matthew's account because Matthew's actually fuller. He gives the Gospels have certain things in common, and then they have certain complementary differences, right? Some will abbreviate something, others will expand on it. But if you look back in Matthew 23, Jesus is in the temple area, and he pronounces a series of 7 woes on the religious leaders, right? You see it right there, 7 woes of the scribes and Pharisees. If you go down, I'll just read part of it. I'll just pick verse 13. It says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in men's faces, or people's faces, for you neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves." So Jesus is here lambasting the religious leaders. He's pronouncing woes upon them. That's judgment language. He's saying judgment is coming upon you. You find that throughout the prophets. This is a way of indicating judgment. For example, Isaiah 10 says, "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger." It's an interesting text because God refers to Assyria as the rod of his anger. He used Assyria to punish Israel because Israel was being rebellious. But he says, "Woe to Assyria," meaning, yeah, I used you to punish my rebellious people, but now I'm going to punish you for the pride of your own heart, right? I'm now going to judge you. And so as you read in the passage, it begins to talk about the judgment that's going to come upon Assyria. So this is judgment language. Jesus is saying to these religious leaders, you guys are corrupt, and judgment is going to fall upon you. So if you scroll down, you'll notice, go to around like verse 34, 35, 36. Notice it says, well, actually, I'll go to verse 32. Jesus says, "Fill up then the measure of your fathers, you serpents, you brood of vipers," that is, offspring of serpents. "How are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore, I am going to send," is the force of this, "I'm going to send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you," he's talking to them, "some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar." I'm sorry. Some of this I don't know what translation you have there, but
It's ESV.
although I'm reading it, I get ahead of myself in my head. And but anyway, it's accurate translation. But sanctuary and the altar. "Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." Okay, so Jesus is, in my view, clearly predicting that judgment is going to fall upon the generation of people to whom he was speaking. I think the mistake that some people make is in assuming that every reference to judgment in the New Testament has to be a reference to the final judgment. I don't take that view, and I think there's only too much evidence to tell us that Jesus also had in view a decisive judgment that was going to fall upon that generation of people. If you look in Matthew's gospel, and notice, by the way, he uses the near demonstrative. He says, "this generation." Okay, you'll see a further reason why this is significant in a moment. But here he uses the near demonstrative. Go look throughout Matthew's gospel. Every time this phrase is used, "this generation," it always refers to Jesus' contemporaries, right? He says, "This generation seeks after a sign," right? This is a wicked and adulterous generation. He's not talking about a generation thousands of years in the future. Okay, now I think some Christians have been over anxious to get around what they think is a problem and say, well, this could be referring to a very distant future generation for whatever reason. Some will say that generation can refer to this race, right? This race, is going to experience these things. That's not how the phrase is ever used, right? This generation, the near demonstrative used with generation, always refers to Jesus' contemporaries. There are other ways Christians have tried to explain this. I don't think you need to do that. You don't have to make every prediction about judgment have to refer to the final judgment. I think Jesus clearly here is talking to his contemporaries. And what seals the deal is, now go to chapter 24, look at verses 1 and 2. So that Jesus quits the temple, if you will. He leaves the temple, and now they're on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, and they can see the temple and all the other buildings in its vicinity. And we're told that the disciples pointed out to him all the buildings, right? Look how beautiful and magnificent this all is, right? These buildings are clearly inimitable. These can't be, I'm kidding. I had to throw that in there. But, clearly these have to be from God and they can't be destroyed. And Jesus says, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Now just read contextually. What buildings is he talking about being torn down? He's not talking about a temple that is yet to be rebuilt. they're pointing to the temple that Jesus said is going to be torn down, right? And he says, not one stone here is going to be left on top of another. That exactly happened to a T. I mean, you can read Josephus, who gives us this in painstaking detail. In fact, we know that, for example, when the Romans went in to destroy Jerusalem, they weren't supposed to destroy the temple because the emperor wanted the gold, the gold that overlaid the temple and the artifacts and all that. But something happened. I won't get into all the details. The temple is actually set on fire. And because of that, it became necessary for the Romans to pry it apart brick by brick to get all the gold that had melted between the cracks and all the rest of it. So they literally, turned over every stone in Jerusalem. And they plowed it up so much so that Josephus could say that if you had come upon Jerusalem after its devastation at the hands of the Romans, you wouldn't even know that there had ever been a city there. That's the way Josephus describes this. Okay, but now go down to verse 34 in Matthew 24. I'm just skipping over some of this to get to the relevant point. Actually, verse 32. So he says, from the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation, note the near demonstrative, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. A generation in the Bible is 40 years. The generation of the Israelites that dwelt in the wilderness, they were there for 40 years, right? That's a generation in the Bible. Jesus is predicting this in AD 33, and the destruction of the temple takes place in AD 70. It's precisely within the time frame, not like Muhammad's prophecy, right? Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. But now, note this further fact about the near demonstrative. In verse 34, he uses the near demonstrative. I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. But note what happens in verse 36. Verse 36 says, but, so now you have an adversative. Okay, it indicates a shift. Okay, that's the function of this in Greek. There's a shift taking place here. He's been talking about one thing, now he's shifting. Okay, he said this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. But concerning that day, now what kind of demonstrative is he using? Not the near demonstrative, but the far demonstrative. He doesn't say, he's not now talking about this generation, but that day. So there's been a shift. He now uses the far demonstrative, and he says, of that day and hour, nobody knows. So what I'm suggesting here is that Jesus begins by talking about the destruction that's coming upon Jerusalem, and then shifts to talk about the final judgment that is portended by Jerusalem's destruction. That is, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple is a harbinger of that final great day. But it is the end for Jerusalem. For Jerusalem, its world is crashing down. It's coming to an end. But, and what further proves this, and I won't belabor this, but if you then read what subsequently happens, everything that has happened prior to this, Jesus seems to indicate that it's not far off, right? This generation won't pass away till all these things happen. And he gives you a series of things to look for, things that you can see, and then when you see them, you know that it's at the door and that sort of thing. But when Jesus, after this shift in verse 36, begins to tell parables, all of a sudden it takes on a very different flavor. All of a sudden it seems to be speaking now in terms of a long period of time, right? He tells a parable about leaving certain people in charge and then going away for a long period of time before he returns, right? He tells the parable, and he even uses that language, right? After a long time, right? No longer is it this generation, it's now after a long period of time. Then the parable of the 10 virgins. Some virgins don't prepare enough oil. They're not prepared for the long haul. And so they run out of oil before the master returns, right? All the parables after this began to speak more long term. So I don't have a problem with this text at all. And by the way, this is how many early Christians understood the text. Okay, this isn't a later Christian concoction to try and account for an apparent problem. This was pretty standard. If you read, for example, Eusebius, he was the father of church history. If you read his book, The Proof of the Gospel, this is the sort of thing that he points to as one of the greatest proofs of the truth of Christianity, that Jesus predicted that within a generation, the temple itself was going to be destroyed. Now, this was something that no Jew thought possible. I mean, even though the temple had been destroyed before under the Babylonians, at that time, the Jews knew it was because of their idolatry, their forsaking God, and they learned their lesson. All Jews at the time of Jesus presumed upon their fidelity to God's word. They didn't think they were idolaters. They didn't realize that they were rejecting the Messiah. Right? In fact, if you look at Luke 19, Jesus says, actually, let me pull up Luke 19 real quick. In Luke 19, Jesus, verse 41, it says, when he approached Jerusalem, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, if you had known in this day, even you, the things which make for peace, but now they have been hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will throw up a barricade against you and surround you and hem you in on every side, and they will level you to the ground and your children within you, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. Okay, so Jesus links this destruction with their failure to recognize him. Right? That's why the temple is going to be destroyed. No Jew thought that the temple could be destroyed unless they were abandoned by God, and no Jew believed they were going to be abandoned by God because they all thought they were being faithful to God. Right? But the critical test of their fidelity was how they responded to the Messiah. So Jesus is telling them that the temple is going to be destroyed, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed in that generation, and that's exactly what happened. And so the early Christians used this as one of the great proofs of the truth of Christianity, and so much so that if, I don't know if you're familiar with Julian the Apostate, but remember, at the time of Constantine, he had made Christianity a religio licita. Prior to Constantine, it was outlawed that you couldn't be a Christian. Under Constantine, it's now legal to be a Christian, right? And then eventually Christianity becomes the official religion of the empire. Well, one of the successors to the imperial throne, Julian, he actually is an apostate, so he departs from Christianity. And so one of the things that he wants to do is to discredit Christianity. And in his mind, one way he can discredit Christianity is by rebuilding Jerusalem and establishing the temple again. And so he enlists the Jews, and he even funds the project, and the Jews go back and they start trying to build the temple. And it's actually really interesting. You make of this story what you will, but according to the historical reports, when the Jews were trying to reconstruct the temple under Julian, we're told that subterranean vaults ignited and people were consumed by fire in the process of trying to rebuild the temple. And after that, I think not without its own relevance, Muslims eventually established the Al-Aqsa Mosque, right, and the Dome of the Rock and all that. And now there's a problem there. Jews haven't been able to build a temple. There's been no temple in Israel, in Jerusalem, for 2,000 years. Why is that significant? Again, it goes, if you look at the Old Testament prophets when the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, the prophets told them why it was going to be destroyed, and even told them how long the period of their punishment was going to last. If you were to ask a contemporary Jew today, why was the temple destroyed, and why don't you know when it's going to be rebuilt, they couldn't give you an answer. They have no answer. They don't know why it was destroyed. They have no prophetic word. We do. We know why it was destroyed, right? And we know why there's no indication of when it'll be rebuilt, because the whole reason it was destroyed is not only because they had forsaken the Messiah, but because its whole purpose was to point to him. So it no longer serves any purpose after him, right? So, but my point here is this is why it was such a big proof for the early Christians. They kept rubbing this under the noses or into the noses of the pagans. And so I don't find it an embarrassing verse at all. I think it should embarrass the unbeliever. And I think it only becomes a point of embarrassment to Christians if they're dead set on making this one of the many predictions about the end of the world. I just don't think it is. You don't need this verse to be about the end of the world in order to get predictions about the end of the world. I know it upsets some eschatological schemes, but in the end, I'm more concerned with what the Bible teaches and being able to defend it and that sort of thing. And by the way, I just throw in here real quickly, throughout the Old Testament, it speaks of God coming against nations in judgment. It speaks of them as God coming, right? If you look at Isaiah 13, Isaiah 19, you have this language of God coming, riding the clouds into Egypt, and the hearts of the Egyptians melting, and that sort of thing. There wasn't a literal appearance of God on those occasions. And the means that God used to bring about the destruction of Egypt was foreign power, foreign armies, right? When you look at Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, he makes it clear that the means of Israel's destruction and the destruction of the temple was by means of a foreign power, right? He speaks of them being surrounded by armies. In fact, even Matthew, if you look at Matthew, I'll wind it up here, but if you look at the parables leading up to the Olivet Discourse, one parable after another talks about the judgment that's going to fall upon Jerusalem. One of the parables that Jesus tells is he talks about a landowner renting out the vineyard that he had made and then renting it out to people and then sending his servants to collect what they owe him, right? They mistreat the servants, and so he sends more. They mistreat them, and this happens several times, and eventually he says, I'll send my son. And he's telling this parable to the religious leaders. And he says to them, now he sends his son last of all. His son comes, and they say, this is the heir, let's kill him and take what belongs to him. And he says, what do you think that landowner is going to do to those wicked tenants? And they said, he's going to, come in and burn their city with fire. And, the whole description there is of a military conquest. And that's true in one parable after another. My basic response to that, and I'm going to turn the tables here. I'll shut up now, but there's something else to be said here. He's deflecting. He's pointing the finger at Christianity as if it rescues Islam. I don't think it works, but I'm going to turn the tables here.
Yeah. We'll get to that in just a second. I'll just add my 2 cents here in a second. But first, there's 2 Muslims in the chat, Mohammad Mukhtar and Flash99. Guys, if you are listening, I want you to type in the chat, I'm listening, I will be on topic. If you do that, we'll answer your grade school polemics. If you don't, you're going to be blocked because I have a feeling neither of you are actually listening to us. So we'll give them a chance to do that, but I'll just add my 2 cents. I've gone back and forth on this passage a couple times through my journey as a Christian, but I agree with Anthony. I think that the interpretation that the prophecy was for that specific generation and has been fulfilled is the most probable explanation, in which case it's not the least bit embarrassing or problematic. It's quite the opposite. And in addition to what Anthony said, we have quite a number of works that are written in the the second half of the first century and the first half of the second century. And no one seems to be bothered that the end times haven't come. No one seems to really be expecting them. But we do have the epistle of Barnabas that speaks of the destruction of the temple as fulfillment of prophecy, as a proof of the truth of Christianity. So I think that the early Christians probably saw it that way, and I think that's the way it makes the most sense in context.
Yeah, another thing to throw in, you reminded me of this, is according to liberal scholars whom Muslims follow, the Gospels were written much later than conservative. Well, not always much later, but usually liberals are later than conservatives in their dating scheme. So if we just ran with that, and I know that as a matter of fact, Mohammad Hijab dates a lot of these things late because I've heard him talk about it, right? So usually they'll say Matthew, Luke, that for example, are written in the 80s. Okay, just think this through for a moment. If the language, all these things shall come upon this generation, was intended to speak about the end of the world, such that after the generation had passed, if the world hadn't ceased, the prophecy would have been falsified. It makes no sense to say that the gospel writers are now recording this. You know what I'm saying? It just doesn't even work, because then they would be accusing Jesus of making a false prophecy. They're clearly intending to argue that Jesus is the Messiah, not a false prophet, right? So if they're writing this, as somebody like Mohammad Hijab believes, after 80, 70, after that generation winds down, it doesn't make any sense if they understood this to be talking about the end of the world. I'm just doing an internal critique here. On his assumptions, this doesn't make any sense. Okay, but now here's how you turn the tables on this. There are numerous statements in the Islamic sources showing that Muhammad, and they're actually all over the
So
place.
hold that for just a second, because I wanted to bring that up a little bit later in the video.
Oh, okay.
We're almost done for today, probably, but he says a little bit more, and then we'll have a chance to bring that up. So let me bring the video back up here. So let's go ahead and add that to the stream. So Hijab continuing here about how this verse is supposedly most embarrassing in the Bible. I mean, embarrassed by this, saying that the world will end and not finished yet. This was explained in the old time, that the world would end in the time of Jesus, peace be upon him. So just a quick comment here. He doesn't seem to understand that this was spoken by Jesus, this verse that he thinks it refutes Christianity. He thinks it was he does seem to legitimately think this was an Old Testament prophecy that was not fulfilled by that was supposed to be fulfilled in the time of Jesus, when of course it's actually his word. So I think it's a pretty clear indication he doesn't have any clue what he's talking about.
Yeah. He's not a Bible scholar. Well, I mean, you don't have to be a scholar either to know something about it, but he's clearly even beneath that, right? He's just not very sophisticated in his understanding of Christianity. But, even here, even if we give him a pass on some of this and let's say clean up the language and say, maybe, we can spin this and say, what Mohammad Hijab is saying is that the Old Testament says when Jesus came, the world would end. Okay, even that, that doesn't prove anything problematic, because our view isn't that Jesus is only coming once, but that he's coming twice. It's, in fact, a mistake of Jews to think that everything Jesus said and did had to take place in his first coming. We believe that Jesus is coming twice. Jesus said it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer first and then enter into his glory. And we believe that that's taught in the Old Testament itself. It's not just a New Testament teaching, certainly not an after-the-fact attempt to rescue, Jesus from the fact that certain things didn't happen. The Old Testament doesn't lead us to believe that in Christ's first coming, everything is going to be consummated. How else could it speak, for example, if you look at Isaiah 9? Isaiah 9 says, unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, the government will be upon his shoulder, right? It goes on to say, of the increase and peace of his government, there will be no end. It's talking about the increase of his government, indicating that there will be a beginning to it and a progression to it, right? The same thing is seen by Daniel, where Daniel sees a stone cut out of a mountain made, without hands. that smites the image on its feet, and then the image comes crashing down, and then the stone grows till it becomes so large that it fills the earth, right? You have this kind of language about the kingdom being inaugurated and then growing. And so you can't just ignore all these texts that talk about an inauguration of the kingdom, a growth of the kingdom, and only pay attention to texts that talk about the consummation of the kingdom, right? The consummation of the kingdom is when you have in view the end of the world, right? Not these inaugural statements. Jesus, when he came, he said his first words, right? When he is baptized and he begins his public ministry, repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. Jesus does think that the kingdom of God is being inaugurated in his coming. He doesn't think it's being consummated, right? So it is true to say that the Old Testament speaks of the world ending coinciding with the coming of Messiah, but not without also talking about something that precedes this. So, it's just a classic case of only seeing part of what's there. And, the New Testament is replete with, statements to this effect as well, that there are certain things that are happening now, certain things that will happen later.
Absolutely. So this will be our last segment for today here. So hijab continues. This did not happen, but the opposite happened. And if something like that happened in the Quran, when God Almighty said the Romans had been defeated in a nearby land, yet following their defeat they will triumph, those infidels and skeptics would use this as an argument against Islam.
Yes.
So we'll just cut off the Roman part because we've already addressed that. But what if something like this happened, where the Quran predicted the end of the world, or Muhammad predicted the end of the world, and then it didn't come to pass?
Well, according to Mohammad Hijab, it would be used as an argument against Islam, and he's apparently agreeing with that, right?
Yes,
he's not disagreeing with that. He's affirming it. This would be a disproof of Islam. Now, I think we have that already in the supposed Roman prophecy. It didn't happen as Muhammad predicted, even though it's not impressive as far as prophecies go that he would see, one party getting the better of the other in a history where that was happening back and forth. But he's wrong. Even then, he doesn't get the years right. And yet what Muslims do is not say, okay, we're going to follow this out to its logical end and recognize that Muhammad was a false prophet. What they usually do is they end up maneuvering and trying to make excuses, right? Rationalizations for why this shouldn't really count as a false prophecy. But let's, here, Mohammad Hijab has now given it to us all wrapped up in a bow, right? He has said that when Muhammad said these things were going to happen soon, it means 3 to 9 years. It's, within this limited time frame. He has told us that if Muhammad had made predictions of that sort about the end of the world, which he thinks the Bible is guilty of, then it would prove the Quran false, and everybody would point to these sorts of things to demonstrate that point. Well, the fact of the matter is that's exactly what we have in the Islamic sources, right? And so here's a couple of examples of this. Actually, there's so many examples of this, but here is Sahih Bukhari, Volume 4, Book 55, number 658, narrated Abu Huraira. Allah's apostle said, "How will you be when the son of Mary," now notice he says, he's speaking to his companions. He says, "How will you be when the son of Mary descends amongst you, and he will judge you by the law of the Quran and not by the law of the gospel." So the first thing to emphasize, there's more, but to emphasize is that Muhammad is addressing this to his companions, and he's talking about the son of Mary descending among them. Now, just from this hadith, maybe somebody will say, okay, he's using this language, though, but it's in a generic sense. It just means you people, this ummah, right? So that it doesn't have to necessarily terminate on that group that's alive at his time. It could be those who come after them, right? The problem is this is stated so many times in so many different ways that this kind of escape doesn't work. Here's another hadith. This is Sahih Bukhari, Volume 3, Book 34, number 425. It says, narrated Abu Huraira, Allah's apostle said, by him in whose hands my soul is. So notice Muhammad is swearing here in the name of Allah, which increases the culpability of Muhammad, right? Not only that he would speak as if he were a prophet and make a false prophecy, but even swearing in the name of Allah, that just increases his culpability exponentially. But he says, by him in whose hand my soul is, the Son of Mary will shortly descend amongst you people. So now, not only do we have Muhammad saying that he will descend among you, speaking to his contemporaries, now he says he will descend shortly amongst you people. And that's not it. Here is Sahih Muslim, Book 1, number 287, narrated Abu Huraira, the apostle, the messenger of Allah said, by him in whose hand is my life, the Son of Mary will soon descend among you as a just judge. So Muhammad has said among you, he has said shortly, and now he has said soon, right? And I've only read for you 3 different hadiths. This is only a smattering of the many examples of this sort of thing in the Islamic sources. You have, I could quote several other hadiths here, where Muhammad says amongst you, where he says soon, where he says shortly. And it's clear from all of this that Muhammad thinks that Jesus is going to descend during the lifetime of his companions. Right? And this is only one line of evidence that Muhammad is wrong, but I thought it was particularly relevant because Mohammad Hijab not only has appealed to things that he thought were predictions that were valid, that proved Muhammad's prophethood, but he even tried to suggest that Jesus was wrong when Jesus was actually right, but Muhammad ends up actually being wrong on this same issue, right? I'm sorry, I don't mean to speak while Thaddeus is typing.
Sorry. So I had muted Mohammed Mukhtar, and he has come back from timeout because I only put him in timeout for 5 minutes, like children should be. And now he's like, I don't understand why I was timed out. Well, if he was listening, he would have known. Continue. Did you have something else you want to say, or?
Well, I don't know. Were any of these Muslims that are present going to interact, or was he on timeout because he wasn't? And
oh, well, he's back now. If any of them, we don't. If it's we'll take a comment on, not directly on the material, if you prove you're actually listening, and you haven't done that. You got to prove you're listening. Then I'll take one of your comments that's off topic, but. You didn't even bring up the hadith that I had pulled up here.
Oh, okay. What do you got there?
So this one is Sahih Muslim 2953. Someone asks Allah's apostle when that last hour would come. Thereupon Allah's messenger kept quiet for a while. Then he looked at a young boy in his presence, belonging to some tribe, and he said, if this boy lives, he would not be very old till the last hour would have come to you. And then Nas said that this young boy was of our age during those days. So this boy, I don't know, let's say 12-year-old, is not going to be very old, let's say 30, when the end times come. Even if we don't take this too seriously, it's got to be in his lifetime, right? So that's 100 years maximum?
Yeah, I mean, so he says, if this boy lives. So he's using this boy as the the reference point. So
Right. Yeah.
if he continues to live, he wouldn't get very old. So, yeah, I mean, we could be magnanimous here and say, maybe Muhammad thought this boy was going to be a centenarian, right?
Right.
And live to be 100 or maybe 120. Let's be real magnanimous. Muhammad's wrong. He's off up to this point. By what 1300? 12 to 1300 years or so. I don't know.
Definitely.
Not very close. Not
All
very
right.
close.
So Annie Adosa says they dismiss this by saying he died, so the boy didn't live. But clearly, what Muhammad's saying is he's not saying that it'll happen in his lifetime. He's saying that it'll happen within the time that it would take for him to grow old, whether or
Yeah.
not he actually grows old.
Yeah, and see, so anything that you say here to cover up this problem has to then work with other problems. And at least I was doing, I was bringing up an example that I thought was similar to what Mohammad Hijab thought he had against the Bible. But when we start putting in all the different factors here, you brought up something a little different than what I was looking at. I was focusing on the descent of Jesus and it being soon and shortly. But if we start putting in all the factors, then their explanation of this has to comport with the explanation they're trying to give for these other things. And so what ends up happening, though, is it sometimes an answer will look fine when trying to deal with one issue, but it throws what you want to do with something else out of whack. You know what I mean? So I'm just pointing out here that we're only bringing up a couple of different examples. There are other passages where Muhammad says that something along the lines of, everybody alive on earth will. I'm trying to think of the exact prophecy, but there are numerous other prophecies that word things differently, where you can't just say, "Oh, well, the boy died," kind of thing, because the qualifications end up being something different. Trying to think what I could probably pull this up here.
Yeah, there's another one. I didn't have it pulled up, but there's another one that says that there won't be any people alive in 100 years.
Yeah, that's the one I'm thinking of. Yeah. So in that case, it's not bound to the particular boy living, even though that's not the point either in this hadith, right?
Absolutely. So, Muhammad, it says, dude, I've got like 10 people asking me questions. Simple solution there. Prove you're listening, and then give your best argument, and then we'll address it directly. You don't have to try to distract the chat. You can just get your argument up here for us all to see. I suspect he isn't listening, but I did save his comment from him earlier because I just thought it was so great, because he was arguing that this was proof of Islam here. Have we not smoothed out the earth like a bed and made the mountains as its pegs? They didn't know about this science until the recent century. Anthony, I know you're not a scientist, but has the earth been smoothed out? Is that an accurate description of the earth?
Well, here's the interesting thing. If this statement is just taken as if it were poetic, I wouldn't have a problem with it, right? I mean, I think you can poetically speak about the earth being, like a carpet and that sort of thing. But if you're going to try and prove this or use this as a literal statement and say it's a scientifically accurate statement, a scientific miracle, like we can speak casually in everyday speech. Nobody thinks that we're being inaccurate. If I say, if I talk about the four corners of the earth, or every day, we say things like, oh, the sun has risen, right? The sun has set. We're using phenomenological language. We don't literally think the sun is going up and down, right? We understand that that's the way it appears because of our situation, right? Where we're situated. So if all you wanted to say is the Quran is just using figurative language, or it's a metaphor, like Mohammad Hijab is saying, that's fine, but then it no longer serves as a scientific example.
Yeah, I find this hilarious that he's telling you that the smoothing is a metaphor, but the mountains being pegs is not a metaphor. That's a scientific miracle.
Yeah, make up your mind. And they're not, right? In the they're not like um what is it you put on a cork board, the little push pins, but the way the Quran words it, if you're going to take it literally, is that the earth is like a carpet and the mountains are like little pins that are being pushed into it to hold it in place or something. So the world, the
So,
earth.
oops, sorry, that
Oh, go
was
ahead.
the wrong one. I
Oh,
thought that was him repeating it, but he said that we should get to answering some questions, and that's why I accidentally pulled that up because I thought it was this. You say false prophet, but the very religion he reestablished is the fastest growing right now. Explain that.
okay. So several issues here. First of all, rapid growth of something doesn't prove that it's good or true, right? Gangrene spreads quickly. Gangrene's not good. I don't recommend it, right? Don't go out and get gangrene. The other thing is live by your own presuppositions. You as a Muslim believe that every person is born a Muslim, right? According to Muhammad in the Hadith, every person is born upon fitra, that is the right belief or disposition regarding monotheism, tawheed. But according to Muhammad, every person, though born a Muslim, becomes something else, either a Jew, a Hindu, a Christian, because they're parents, right? So what does this mean? There are 7+ billion people on the planet today, right? How many of them are Muslims? Let's be magnanimous, right? Let's say 2 billion. Is that fair? Right? I don't think that's an exact figure, but let's just say it's 2 billion. 7 billion people on planet Earth right now were born Muslims. 5 billion of them are not Muslims anymore by your own standards, which means that Islam is the fastest shrinking religion. Okay, Islam is shrinking faster than any other religion on the planet. No other religion could possibly say that they have lost 5 billion adherents. Okay, Islam alone has plummeted at such a rapid rate. I mean, it's incredible. There are people that are leaving Islam by the droves, right? As soon as a birth is happening to a Jew and a Hindu and everything else, those children are departing from Islam. So number one, just because something grows quickly doesn't prove that it's true. Just because, and it's not true that Islam is rapidly growing. Number three, a lot of the figures that look at growth of Islam, number one, never turn around and factor in all the apostasy that takes place. A lot of these people that convert to Islam, if they're not being born into a Muslim family, they end up leaving Islam after a few years. Why? Because they enter Islam as a result of being lied to in most cases. There's scientific miracles in the Quran. Look, the earth is spread out like a carpet and the mountains are like pegs. Oh, that's not scientifically accurate. Oh, that's just a metaphor. Well, wait a minute. I came to Islam because you told me there was this scientific miracle in the Quran. Now you're telling me it's just a metaphor because I looked into the science, right? They're seeing through, after a while, the lies they were told, and they're leaving Islam. And so that has to be taken into account. You also have to take into account the fact that Muslims have high birth rates, right? So, having multiple wives and giving birth to more children than now, I actually think it's an argument that Christians should be more fruitful. So I'm not criticizing Muslims for having many children, although I would criticize the polygamous aspect. But that's not impressive that Muslims are having a lot of babies, and so their numbers are increasing, right? My family increases too every time we have a child. And if I have more children than my next door neighbor, that doesn't prove that my religion, let's suppose that I have Muslims living next door to me and they can't have children for whatever reason, and we have 10. Does that mean Islam's false? This kind of argument reminds me, David just did a video on this, by the way. It reminds me of the Muslims who think, hey, look, Habib, constantly won his fights in the UFC, right? Habib was a UFC fighter, and he's Muslim. And he was a good fighter, and he had a perfect record, so Muslims constantly celebrate him. and act as if him winning proves Islam. So then David does this video showing that Tyson Fury, the heavyweight champion in boxing, is a Christian, just won again. And he says, what, does this prove Christianity is true? Right? And here's something that Muslims, they always want to ignore. You love to tell us that Islam's the fastest growing religion. Number one, as I said, that's not true. Number two, if anything, it's because of high birth rates. Number three, there's a large scale apostasy that takes place among Muslims. But the fourth thing is you're still second in terms of the numbers game, baby. You guys are still second. Christianity is still ahead of you. So what? How do I determine between those two observations which one, should I think that the religion that has the most people that adhere to it is the true religion? Or should I say that it's the one that's growing the fastest? And how do I know whether Islam's going to continue to grow at the rate that it's growing now? It's not as if Islam has always grown at the same rate. And Christianity has seen great surges at different times in its history. There are times when there have been remarkable turnarounds in a nation's history. There have been remarkable events in our own history in America. There was the Great Awakening, where the country, had for quite a while turned away from its Christian moorings and then suddenly experienced a reawakening, and Christians had, renewed their faith and so forth. I don't find this sort of argument all that impressive, but Muslims do, and I think it shows, though, something about their underlying assumptions. The underlying assumption is they think that truth is proven by power, right? I don't think that it's sort of like the old philosophical argument that what's the philosophical view that anyways, there's a particular philosophical view that might makes right. Might makes right.
Well, that's what I was thinking, but I thought you were going for a more sophisticated term.
Yeah. Well, that's it. But we don't believe that. We don't believe might makes right. Think about it at the time of Muhammad. Nobody knew if Islam was going to grow or not, in the ultimate sense. So when Muhammad has just a few followers, does that prove that Islam was false at that time? And nobody's converting to Islam for the first decade, at least, of Muhammad's prophethood. Nobody's converting basically at all. So at one point in Islam's history, it wasn't the fastest growing, and another time it is. That's just, to me, the argument is flounders all over the place.
Yeah, absolutely. If we take their argument seriously, then Islam's gone in and out of being the correct religion at different time periods when it was the fastest or not fastest growing. But Muhammad did say, if I elaborate, which I should have done, it is the fastest growing revert-wise, my fault for not being clear. But that's actually the most obviously false claim. Islam probably has the lowest conversion in rate of any religion, or at least any religion of any size.
In terms of people, they use the term revert, obviously. Now, you know why they use the term revert? It's because of what I was referring to before. They think everybody was born a Muslim, and so if they're not a Muslim now, it's because they left Islam some point after their conception and birth, so that when they now become Muslims, they're actually coming back to Islam. They're reverting to what their original faith was. Right. That begs the question, though, obviously, from an Islamic perspective. We don't think people are born Muslims. Right. We don't believe that everybody's leaving Islam by the droves, by the billions. That's an Islamic view. So they speak in terms of reversions to Islam. If we just limited the number of people to convert to Islam, to use the non-biased language, then it wouldn't be true. If you don't factor in all the birth rate and all that kind of stuff, then it's not true.
Yeah, absolutely. They're somewhat protected because they've historically had a very low apostasy rate for unknown reasons. But that doesn't seem to be so true in the modern world, where they can no longer execute people for leaving Islam. So
Mm.
now they have a low conversion in rate, and at least in outside the Muslim world, a high apostasy rate. Not a good uh, formula there, but it is made up for now by the higher than average birth rate.
Yeah, in fact, that reminds me, there have been a lot of Muslims recently that are bemoaning the large number of people that are leaving Islam. So it seems like these Islamic clerics are on a different page than a lot of these guys that are playing apologists for Islam. They're concerned about the rapid departure from Islam. They don't think that Islam is just bringing people in rather than losing them out the other end. And in fact, a lot of the apostasy comes from people who were born Muslims. That's one of the things that they're most concerned about. But we also know that people that convert to Islam leave it within 3 to 5 years, because not just because of the bogus claims about like scientific miracles. Initially people aren't. It's foolish for them to convert to Islam without looking into these things to begin with. But initially, some people aren't in a position to check some of this stuff. But the more they learn about Islam, the more they are in a position to go to the sources and find out some of the details. So, for example, I think it was Hatun who recently posted a video of somebody who converted to Islam, and then she was talking about Muhammad marrying Aisha at 6, bedding her at 9, and this guy was saying, "I didn't know that." Basically, I think he said something like, "I was told that there's only one source that says that, and all the other sources say it was later," and all that kind of thing. So that shows you that this person came to Islam under false pretenses. He didn't have a good knowledge of the religion. That sort of thing being brought to somebody's attention who converted to Islam often leads to their deconversion, right? So you can't just count people going to Islam after being sold a bill of goods and then leaving Islam because they found out it was a lie.
Absolutely. Have a super chat from Happy Camper. It seems like apostasy will reach 50% in the United States.
Praise the Lord.
Amen. And I think the United States would definitely be the most likely or the easiest country to apostatize in. So, people quote this 24% number. I actually did my own research, and the survey of 20 years of survey data from the United States suggests it was 31% historically. So 50%, hey, let's get there. And I think that it will happen because N.A. Adessa makes a good point here. I think apostasy from Islam is slowly becoming normalized in the Middle East, so we'll see it more and more. And I think that's what's going to happen. What it will look like to the outside world is all of a sudden, like overnight, 30% of the population no longer believes in Islam, but it'll really have happened slowly over a long period of time, and people will just suddenly realize how many there are, and they'll feel comfortable expressing their true beliefs. So I think that at some point there's going to be a snap overnight, all these people suddenly saying they're ex-Muslims. So Muhammad says, if it's not a valid argument, then why use it? Presumably in reference to David making the mocking argument. And the point was to show you it's an invalid argument. That's why David made that argument.
Yeah, if you can use an argument to prove two contrary conclusions, then that shows the argument's not good, right? If the same form of argumentation can be used to prove A, and then it can also be used to prove not A, then there's something wrong with the argument, right? That's David's point. If that argument, Khabib is the champion or was, proved Islam true, then Tyson Fury being the champion and a Christian proves Christianity is true, right? There's something wrong with the argument if it gives you contradictory conclusions.
Absolutely. We had someone going by Azog Gaming come in. They were spamming the chat over and over again. I asked if they were listening. They said yes, but then they kept spamming. But I did say I would address this. So 3 equals 1. Explain, please.
Yeah, well, I mean, we might just as well return the favor. 99 equals 1. Explain, please. Now, let me flesh that out. Now, I'm playing your game because remember, you guys like to turn, and you're supposed to be defending Islam, but you're attacking Christianity. Islam teaches that Allah has multiple attributes. And some Muslims will say the 99 names of Allah entail 99 attributes. And since these aren't the only names, they're only, if you look at the hadith that suggests that there's more names than this, then Allah has more than 99 attributes. The reason this is significant is because in the history of Islam, the relationship of Allah's essence to his attributes and his attributes to one another has been a huge problem. Some Muslims said you can't say Allah has attributes without falling prey to the same error as the Christians, because then you're introducing multiplicity into Allah, who's ultimately one. And those Muslims were known as the Mu'tazili. And yet they were ultimately rejected by Muslims. So they're not considered orthodox by Sunni Islam. And a lot of Shia are still along this mindset, right? This is what a lot of Shia still believe. Muhammad Assad, who's not a Shia, he believes that. So there are other Muslims even floating in Sunni circles who believe that sort of thing. But they charge those who believe that Allah has attributes with shirk for saying that Allah is characterized by a multiplicity. The Orthodox Sunni position says, no, he has real attributes. They're really distinct from his essence and distinct from one another. Okay. Now, let me give an illustration here. One of the attributes of Allah is his speech. According to Muslims, since it's Allah's attribute and Allah's attributes are eternal, Allah's speech is eternal. The Quran is Allah's speech, therefore the Quran is eternal. But the Quran is not Allah, right? So in Islam, you have Allah and the Quran, his eternal speech, both of which are eternal, but neither of which are the other. So one of Allah's attributes, the Quran, which is not Allah, is still eternal and other than him. That entails at least 2. But now if we introduce all the other attributes, now we've got hundreds of, distinct entities that comprise Allah's being. Okay. Now, what do Christians believe? Here's the answer to your question. Here's the direct answer. Christians don't believe anything so silly as that. We say that the persons of the Trinity are one as to their fundamental nature and essence, meaning that the essence of deity, that which makes God God, belongs wholly and entirely, without separation, without division, to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. What distinguishes the persons from each other is not their essence, but their personhood, their identity. And so that's what we mean. We're not saying he's 3 in the same sense that he's 1, or 1 in the same sense that he's 3. God is 1 in essence, 3 in person. But Muslims are really affirming separable things when they talk about Allah. The Quran is not the same. It's not 1 in essence with Allah, but distinct in personhood. It's a different thing than Allah. So Muslims really are polytheists, and Christians alone are monotheists. Oh, you muted yourself.
Sorry. Swati helped us out. He said Christians say 3 persons, 1 being. Exactly. That's exactly what we say. What you're trying to do, though, is equate person with being, which is incorrect. And we had several comments along this line that the attributes don't equal different people. And that's the point, that the argument doesn't work. Just because you're multiple in one category doesn't mean you can't be singular in another category. Yeah, we're not saying they're identical. We're just that names are identical to people. We're saying it's the same principle, that different categories, different numbers.
Yeah. And besides that, though, how's that superior? You guys literally have multiple eternal realities. Allah, a personal being, and the Quran, a supposedly impersonal thing. Okay, so it sounds like Islam now is a mixture of Hinduism and Buddhism, and I mean, a variety of religions. Just because some of your eternal realities, your eternal deities, are impersonal, doesn't somehow get you off the hook. That looks even worse to me as a Christian. For you, ultimate reality is not ultimately determined in a personal way. We say that ultimate reality is a personal being, a tripersonal being. You're telling us that ultimate reality is not ultimately one, it's diverse because there are these multiple things, and some of them are impersonal things that belong to a person, I guess, in some sense. I mean, I don't know. What's the relationship between these eternal things that all exist somehow as their own entities? But the other thing to say is, if you look at the Islamic sources, it's not obvious to me that these things are impersonal. Muslims believe the Quran is going to intercede for them on the day of resurrection. Well, that sounds kind of personal to me. So how's the Quran going to intercede for you? So not only is this thing eternal and other than Allah, it has the power of intercession. If it's an attribute, it's not like 99 and 1. It's not a being. Like, he is merciful, but that's not a person. Trinity introduces 3 different beings. No, that's exactly what I said the Trinity doesn't involve. I said that God, in fact, Swati already helped you out here. You have 3 persons who are one in being, or 3 persons who are one in essence. And Thaddeus had said that we're talking about different categories here, being and personhood. God is one in being, 3 in personhood. Islam, on the other hand, teaches that there are multiple beings, multiple entities. That's Orthodox Sunnism, right? Take any book off the shelf on Ashari Islam or Maturidi Islam, all part of the Orthodox Sunni approach to Aqidah theology. They tell you that these things are hypostatic entities, actually existing things. And so, I mean, you could be a Mu'tazili and say Allah doesn't have a plurality of attributes. You'd be more consistent, but you wouldn't be an Orthodox Sunni Muslim. You muted yourself again.
Yep, sorry. Swati did ask a legitimate question here. What is the difference between being and person?
Yeah, well, being is what something is, and person is who something is. So this cup has being, but it's not a person. So there's clearly a difference between being and person, right? If being just meant a person, then you couldn't have something existing, having being, and being impersonal. Like those impersonal attributes of Allah, right? You said they're not persons, but they're beings. They exist. They have existence. So personhood and being are not the same thing. And so just because something is a being doesn't mean it has personhood. And then by the same token, I would say if being and personhood are not coextensive, then you could have a being that's 3 persons.
Absolutely. So Umair said he is an atheist, and he asked this question: why do you guys believe in Jesus?
So you said he's an atheist?
Yeah, well, he said he was in the chat. He said that he left Islam because it was obviously false, but now he's an atheist.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are any number of reasons you can give for any why question, right? I don't think we can fully cover it here, but I'll say this. Personally, in terms of my own conversion, when I read the Bible, it spoke accurately to my condition. I recognized that what it said about me was true, and that I was in a world of trouble, and the solution the Bible offered to my accurately diagnosed problem, I saw as my only hope of escape from my predicament. And then from there, I began to learn more and more about this book that told me about my problem and its solution. And I saw any number of reasons that confirmed that I made a legitimate decision. other people come at this differently. You know, some people were able to hear all sorts of evidence. Other people heard all sorts of reasons, right? But I'm just describing my own personal trek here. I began to read the Bible, and I noticed remarkable predictions that put the Quran to shame. You know, all the way back in Genesis 3:15, God said to Satan, I'll put enmity between you and the woman and between your seed and hers. He will crush your head. You will bruise his heel. So already in Genesis 3, there's this prediction that Satan is going to be defeated by a descendant of the woman. And in the course of defeating Satan, he's going to be wounded in his heel. That prophecy is like a snowball throughout the Old Testament. It gets larger and larger as more details are added to it. We're told where this person will come from, what line of people, what tribe. We're told where he'll be born, the sorts of things that he'll say and do in his life, how he'll die. And this is done in so many remarkable ways that, to me, it's breathtaking. And, you know, you could easily add other things to it. There's historical evidence for these things, the factuality of these things. You know, the classic evidential case for Christianity is to say that we have good evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus affirmed the inspiration of the scriptures. Therefore, if Jesus rose from the dead and he told us the scriptures are inspired, we have good reason to believe them. And the evidence for Jesus rising from the dead is that the people that saw or were present for him being crucified were also witnesses to his resurrection and testified to it and sealed their testimony with their blood, you know, and on and on. You know, I'm not pretending that's a full case. I'm just saying that this is far too broad to deal with in 5 minutes.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, just a brief answer, because he does seem to be legitimately seeking. And a number of people in chat offered their own explanations, compatible with what Anthony said. We believe in the truth because Christianity is historically discoverable. Jesus is sinless, a perfect example to follow. Jesus allows us back into right relationship with God through his sacrifice on the cross. Jesus is who the prophets were all speaking of, as promised by God to Abraham. Jesus conquered the death, fed the hungry, healed the sick, forgave the sinners. Jesus saves, Muhammad slaves. And simply put, his corpse left the grave. And I'll just add my own answer very briefly. When I'm asked why I'm a Christian, or because it's true. And then I follow that with, I can make a thorough case, but that would take hours to lay out at minimum. But I'm highly confident that any honest examination of all the evidence, carefully considered, will lead one to Christ. And if it doesn't, then I would want to know that too. I want to go where the evidence leads. I don't want to go where my emotions tell me to go. I don't want to go where my parents told me to go. I want to go where the evidence leads. And if Christianity is not true, then I want to know that. But if it is true, I especially want to know that, because my eternal destiny is on the line here. And only Christianity offers a real solution to the sin problem. I found that all of the world religions are in essence the same. They're very different, right? They're very different. They teach very different things. I'm not saying they're, I'm not espousing a thing where I'm saying there's no distinction between religions, but they all share one thing in common, and that's that they all, in one way or another, teach you that you can earn your own salvation. And this includes atheism. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, try harder, do your best, do these special practices, whatever. And if you do the right things, you try hard enough, you eventually achieve your own salvation, whatever that means to that religion. Christianity alone teaches something different. It teaches that we are incapable of saving ourselves, that we are fallen sinners, that there's something not right about the world, but that God himself intervened to make things right. And he came to the earth, became incarnate, became a human being, lowered himself to our level. And Muslims say this is embarrassing. We say this is the greatest possible thing God could do for us. And then he takes all our sin off, all our sins, all our guilt upon himself, and he destroys them once and for all on the cross. And in exchange, he imparts his righteousness on us, so that when God looks at us, he sees Christ and not our sins. And that's the only way we can be right with God, because we cannot ever make up for our own sins. And I think we'll close out on that unless Anthony has any last comments.
Nope, I'm good. And my back hurts.
Excellent. We'll work on getting part 2 of this scheduled. We have a few more arguments from Hijab to go through. He has a couple more examples of supposed fulfilled prophecies, and then his last criteria is supposed historical accuracy of the Quran when compared to the Bible. So look out for an announcement for that, and I got a couple more things coming up, so look for those this weekend as well. Have a great evening or morning or midday, whatever it is for you, and God bless.